The diner had no name worth remembering anymore. The hand-painted sign above the door used to read, Deming Desert Grill, in proud red letters, but 40 years of high desert sun had bleached it down to a ghost of pigment on weathered wood, and nobody had bothered to touch it up in at least a decade. Most of the regulars just called it Roy's Place, and they said it the way people say the name of a dental appointment, with resignation rather than affection, because it was the only option for 40 miles in either direction on this particular stretch of Highway 180 in southwestern New Mexico, and resignation was sufficient. Dorothea Wren, Dot, to anyone who had known her longer than 5 minutes, had been working the graveyard shift here for 11 months. She was 68 years old, a woman of good posture and bad knees, with silver hair she kept pinned back under a paper cap, and hands that had seen more human suffering than most people could comprehend or would want to. For 31 years, she had been a charge nurse at Grant County Medical Center up in Silver City. A woman who had held the hands of the dying, talked down the panicking, and kept her voice level in rooms where everyone else was losing their nerve. She had been, by any honest professional measure, exceptional at her work. The kind of exceptional that gets noticed and depended upon and quietly taken for granted the way bedrock gets taken for granted. Retirement had lasted 4 months before Danny arrived. Danny Wren was 9 years old, her late daughter Carol's boy, and he had come to live with Dot following the accident on Interstate 10 that took Carol and her husband Mark in October of the previous year. A semi had crossed the median in the dark near Lordsburg. The investigation took 6 weeks. The paperwork took 3 months. Danny had come to Deming with 2 suitcases, a drawing pad, and a Cardinal sweatshirt that was already worn thin at both elbows. And he had unpacked all 3 items into Dot's spare bedroom with the careful, deliberate efficiency of a child who had learned very recently to treat the placement of his belongings as something that required attention. Danny had his mother's dark eyes and his grandfather's stubborn set to his jaw, and he had a congenital heart defect, a bicuspid aortic valve that his pediatric cardiologist in El Paso, a steady and precise man named Fenwick, described as moderate to severe, with the quiet, measured caution of a professional who had delivered this kind of news to families before and understood that numbers on a chart become something entirely different when they are translated into a grandmother's face across a consultation desk. The surgery to repair it would cost $62,000 at minimum, more if complications arose. Dot's retirement pension covered the mortgage on the small adobe house at the edge of Deming proper, and the utilities in Danny's school supplies and his medications, the metoprolol, the aspirin regimen, the quarterly echocardiograms that Fenwick required to monitor the valve's progression. It did not cover $62,000. The insurance Danny had inherited through his parents' policy had a surgical cap that topped out at $40,000, a number the billing coordinator had recited to Dot over the phone with the weary precision of someone who had watched families dissolve over exactly this kind of arithmetic and had stopped apologizing for it. So Dot had taken the job at Roy's Place. Roy Steck, the owner, had hired her on the spot. A former charge nurse with steady hands and a calm demeanor was an asset on the graveyard shift. When the highway drunks came in and the truckers got belligerent, he paid her $9.40 an hour, which was below New Mexico's minimum wage, a fact Dot had not yet fully absorbed because she had been too exhausted and too frightened about Danny's valve to devote attention to the labor statutes. The tips went into a mason jar on the counter that Roy collected at the end of every shift, distributing what he called a shared pool at his own discretion, which in practice meant Dot received a folded 20 at the end of each week, regardless of what the jar had accumulated. She had not yet confronted Roy about any of this. Confronting Roy Steck felt at this particular moment in her life like one crisis too many, and Dot Wren had learned across 68 years to sequence her crises. Tonight was a Thursday in late March. The high desert at this hour was cold enough to make the joints ache, and the wind off the Florida mountains to the east came in irregular gusts that rattled the diner's aluminum storm door and sent empty paper cups skittering across the cracked asphalt of the parking lot. Inside, the fluorescent tubes above the counter hummed at slightly different frequencies, creating a subtle and perpetual discord that Dot had stopped consciously hearing weeks ago. The coffee machine at the far end of the counter ran continuously, cycling a burnt, over-extracted brew that she replaced every 3 hours, regardless of volume, because letting it go longer than that crossed some private threshold of professional dignity she intended to maintain, regardless of the circumstances. Danny was in the back booth. He was always in the back booth on the nights when Dot's neighbor Patrice couldn't take him. Patrice's grandchildren from Albuquerque were visiting this week, and Dot had told her not to worry about it. Danny slept on a folded sleeping bag with a travel pillow shaped like a dog that Carol had bought him the Christmas before she died. He wore his Cardinals sweatshirt and his flannel pajama pants, and his small chest rose and fell in a rhythm that Dot monitored the way she had once monitored cardiac patients on overnight watch, with a peripheral awareness that never fully switched off, a clinical attention that had become, over the last 11 months, something closer to prayer. His cardiologist had told Dot at their last appointment that Danny was stable. Stable was a word that lived in a narrow valley between reassurance and dread. Stable meant the situation was not immediately dire. It did not mean the situation was acceptable. It did not mean it would remain stable. Fenwick had said they had a window, probably 12 to 18 months, before the valve's deterioration would move from managed concern into surgical necessity. That window was 9 months old now. Dot wiped down the counter for the 4th time. The diner was quiet. It was midnight. A long-haul trucker named Gerald, who came through this stretch every other week and always ordered the same patty melt and black coffee, had left 40 minutes ago. 2 younger men near the end of the counter, she had heard them mention something about a geological survey up near Lordsburg, had paid their check and gone. Dot was alone with the hum of the lights and the sound of Danny breathing in the mason jar sitting at the far end of the counter like a quiet, persistent accusation. She was doing the arithmetic again, the distance between what she had and what she needed, the slope of the savings curve against the urgency of the valve when she heard it. The sound came from the west, carried on the wind, growing from a distant vibration into something she felt in her sternum before she could properly identify it. Not one engine, several. The low, staggered, unmuffled thunder of large displacement motorcycles, a sound with its own texture and register, nothing like the steady highway drone of semis or the thin whine of passing sedans. Dot set down her rag. Through the plate glass front window of the diner, she watched the headlights appear on 180. Not one pair, one then another, the beams sweeping across the blacktop in a loose, rolling formation that kept coming. She counted 5, then 7, then she stopped counting because the formation was still arriving. They swept into the lot with a collective, thunderous deceleration, exhaust notes dropping in pitch as the machine slowed. And then they were parked, a diagonal line of heavy, custom motorcycles, filling the near half of the lot with the practiced, automatic precision of people who had done this 10,000 times on 10,000 lots across a lifetime of highway. Dot stood at the counter with her hands flat on the laminate. She was not afraid precisely. She had spent 3 decades in emergency medicine, and fear for Dot Wren had long since been metabolized into something sharper and more useful. A heightened, exact attentiveness that assessed rather than reacted. She watched the riders dismount. There were 11 of them. They moved with the unhurried deliberateness of people accustomed to being the most significant presence in any given space. They wore heavy leather cuts vests layered over jackets, the leather dark, and worked and studded with the insignia of a club she did not immediately recognize. The back patches she would see when they turned read Iron Mercy, MC, in a curved arc over a stylized set of iron scales, and below that, in a straight bottom rocker, New Mexico. They were large men, most of them broad through the shoulder, deliberate in their movement, with the particular physical economy of people who had learned to occupy exactly the space they needed and no more. The man who came through the door first was the tallest. He ducked slightly under the frame, not from necessity exactly, but from long habit. The reflex of a man who had learned years ago that door frames in this country were not always built with him in mind. He stood 6'3", possibly a fraction more, with a frame that suggested he had been working with his hands his entire adult life, wide through the chest, heavy in the forearm, with a specific density of muscle that comes not from a gym, but from decades of actual physical labor, sustained over years and miles and weather. His hair was iron gray, cropped close, and he had a beard of the same color, neat at the edges, but thick enough to indicate he had stopped caring about what it looked like to other people sometime in the previous decade. His face was a map of decisions made and lived with. A scar ran from the outside corner of his left eye down to the jawline, not a surgical scar, not a clean incision line, but the kind of irregular seam left by something that had happened fast and badly and a long time ago. His eyes moving across the diner interior in a single, systematic sweep that took less than 2 seconds were the color of storm weather over the Chihuahuan desert, a gray that shifted toward green depending on the light, reading everything and committing to nothing. The patch above his heart read, Wade. Below the club insignia on his chest, a smaller rectangular patch, President. Dot watched him scan the room. She watched the moment his eyes registered Danny in the back booth, the sleeping bag, the dog pillow, the small, still shape of a child in a Cardinal sweatshirt. And she watched his gaze move on without expression, cataloging and proceeding. She watched him choose the stool at the end of the counter, 2 seats from the mason jar, and lower his weight onto it with the careful, deliberate movement of a man whose body had accumulated a considerable number of miles and had learned to treat transitions between positions as transactions worth respecting. The other 10 men distributed themselves between the counter stools and the 2 large corner booths with the same unhurried efficiency, the low rumble of their conversation filling the diner in the register of people who had no interest in being overheard and no need to perform for the room. Dot picked up her order pad and walked to the end of the counter. Evening, she said. The man named Wade looked up at her. Coffee, he said. His voice was low and level, a baritone that had been roughened by time and weather and decisions into something that carried its own weight. And whatever's hot back there, green chili beef stew, Dot said, made fresh at 10, cornbread on the side. That'll do. A brief pause. For all of us. Dot nodded and went to the kitchen. She did not hurry, and she did not perform calm. She simply moved with the unhurried efficiency of a woman who had managed 30-bed wards through shift changes and supply shortages, and had learned that the most effective response to any high-pressure situation was to do the next correct thing. She ladled 11 bowls of stew. She cut the cornbread. She carried it all out in 2 trips without dropping anything, and set it down the length of the counter and into the booths. She poured coffee fresh from the pot she had started when she heard the engines, because good coffee, after a long, cold ride, was the least that could be offered, and she was not in the habit of offering less than the least. The man named Wade wrapped both hands around his mug, the way men do when they have been cold for a long time, and have stopped admitting it, even to themselves. He looked at the stew. He looked at the cornbread. Then he looked at Dot. You make this, he said. I did, she said. It's good, he said in the tone of a man who did not offer this observation unless he meant it precisely. They ate. The diner was quiet in a different way now. Not the empty quiet of an hour ago, but the occupied quiet of people engaged in the serious business of eating after a long ride in cold weather. Dot refilled coffee cups. She checked on Danny, still sleeping, chest moving steadily. She washed the pot she'd used for the stew and started it soaking. It was near 2 in the morning when she became aware of a change in the quality of light outside. Not the steady amber of the parking lot fixtures. A moving beam yellow-white crossing the far end of the lot without the noise of an engine. She looked up. Two men were in the parking lot. They had come in from the north side on foot, which meant they had left a vehicle somewhere beyond the direct sightline of the lot entrance. They moved with the quick, low-shouldered urgency of people who had no business being where they were and knew it precisely. One of them, thin, dark hoodie, with the jerky, over-attentive movement of a man running on something he should not have taken, was carrying a heavy bolt cutter. The other, heavier and slower, was carrying a length of chain and a set of hydraulic motorcycle lift bars, the kind used in legitimate shops, and also Dot knew from years of listening to police radio in the Silver City ER break room. In organized vehicle theft, they were moving directly toward the line of parked motorcycles. Dot set down her cloth. She had a specific, precise thought, not a feeling, but a clear, rational calculation. If those two men began stripping or attempting to move any of those machines, what happened next in this parking lot would be immediate, violent, and catastrophic for every plan she had for keeping Danny safe and fed and alive. This diner, Roy's underpaying, irregularly run enterprise, was nonetheless the thing standing between her and a situation she could not afford. Crime scene. Police tape. Closed for investigation. Unemployed again at 68 with a child's surgery to fund. She did not look at the counter to check whether any of the bikers had noticed. She did not pause to think through whether what she was about to do was tactically wise. She came around the end of the counter, took the iron door prop from beside the entrance, a length of rebar about 18 inches long that Roy kept there to prop the storm door open in summer, and went through the heavy glass door into the cold night air. The wind hit her immediately, cold and dry, cutting in from the east off the mountains. Her paper cap lifted off her hair and sailed away into the dark, and she did not stop to retrieve it. "Hey!" Her voice was not a shout. It was the voice she used in the ER when someone was about to do something irreversible, clear and flat, and carrying the specific authority of someone who expects, without question, to be heard. "Step away from those bikes." The two men froze. They turned. The bolt cutter man stared at her, a 68-year-old woman in a diner uniform, silver-haired, standing 10 feet from him in the parking lot, with a piece of rebar at her side. He laughed, a short, ugly sound. "Lady," he said, "walk back inside before you get yourself hurt. This ain't your business." "I said step away," Dot said. She planted her feet. Her whole body was running on adrenaline, but her voice gave none of it away. 31 years of keeping her voice level in rooms that did not reward panic had built this capacity into her, the way muscle is built by repetition under pressure. "You touch those bikes, you are making the worst decision of your life. I am telling you this as plainly as I know how." The heavier man had turned back to the motorcycles. He was crouching near the front wheel of the largest one, the custom cruiser, at the head of the diagonal line, a machine that even in the dim parking lot light was visibly extraordinary. The kind of object that represented not just money, but years of deliberate, specific attention. His bolt cutter was already positioned against the wheel lock. "Move," the thin man said, and his voice had changed, the amusement stripped out of it, replaced by something flat and cold. He took 2 steps toward her. He was faster than she had calculated for. He grabbed her right forearm with both hands and twisted, trying to strip the rebar from her grip. Dot did not release it. She drove her elbow back into his face with a short, economical motion, the same motion she had used exactly once before in her professional life on a patient in a psychotic episode in the Silver City ER. An incident that the hospital's official report had described with measured institutional diplomacy as appropriate defensive action. The man released her. He reeled backward, both hands going to his nose. The heavier man had turned from the bike. He was coming toward her now, and he was considerably larger than she was. And she was 68 years old, and her right knee had been giving her trouble since January, and it occurred to her with precise clinical clarity that she may have miscalculated the variables. The diner door opened. She did not hear it so much as feel the change in the air at her back, the brief interruption of the wind as a large mass moved through the doorframe. Then a voice. It was not raised, it was not loud. It carried the quality she had heard on rare occasions from men who had been in places and done things that could not be undone. A complete, settled authority that had nothing left to prove to anyone and had therefore stopped trying. Let her go. The heavier man stopped. He looked past Dot. Whatever he saw in that direction rearranged his assessment of the situation completely. His expression changed the way expressions change when the ground shifts under a decision that seemed solid a moment ago. Dot turned. Wade was standing on the concrete step of the diner entrance. He had nothing in his hands. He carried no visible weapon. He was simply standing there with his hands loose at his sides and his storm gray eyes moving between the two men with the systematic attention of someone taking inventory of a problem he has already decided how to resolve. The stillness of him was in that moment the most threatening thing in the parking lot. Behind him in the doorway and spreading out to either side across the lot, the other 10 men had come out quietly. No one had called for them. They had simply come arranging themselves across the width of the lot with an almost architectural efficiency that transformed 11 individuals into something that felt considerably larger and more definitive than 11. The bolt cutter man was the first to move. He simply turned and ran, one hand still pressed to his face, back the way he had come into the dark north end of the lot without looking back. The heavier man stood for 3 seconds. Dot counted them, the clinical habit of a woman who had spent decades measuring intervals. And then he dropped the chain. The sound of it hitting the asphalt was very loud in the quiet. He walked away, not running, walking, because running would have meant admitting what he was admitting by walking, and the walk was all the dignity he had remaining. Dot watched them go. Then she became aware of a sensation in her right forearm, just below the elbow where the man's grip had been. A warmth that was not warmth. She looked down. The skin had been abraded by the grip and by the rebar's edge. Not a cut exactly, but a long, raw stripe that was beginning to produce a thin, bright line of blood along her forearm, seeping into the cuff of her uniform. She registered this information without particular alarm. She had seen considerably worse before breakfast on a regular Thursday. "You're bleeding," said a voice to her left. She looked up. Wade had come off the step and crossed the lot and was standing 4 feet away. He was looking at her forearm with an expression that was not what she expected. Not the hard, closed face of a man reasserting his authority over a situation, but something more careful than that, something that was paying attention. "I'm aware," Dot said. "It's superficial." "Come inside," he said. "I need to check on my grandson first." A brief pause. "The boy in the back booth?" "Yes." He stepped back slightly, and she walked past him into the diner. Danny was still sleeping. The dog pillow had shifted sideways, and she straightened it with her uninjured hand, stood for a moment, listening to his breathing steady, even the particular rhythm she had memorized, the way you memorize the sound of something you cannot afford to lose, and then went behind the counter to the first aid kit mounted on the wall beside the dish rack. She was cleaning the abrasion herself, one-handed with antiseptic gauze, when the man named Wade came and sat back on his stool at the end of the counter. He watched her work. "You came out there alone," he said. "Yes, against 2 men. I could see what they were doing," Dot said. She turned the gauze to a clean side. "I've been in rooms where things went wrong because someone made a decision not to intervene. I've also been in rooms where someone intervened and things didn't go wrong. 31 years of observation. I acted on the data." Wade was quiet for a moment. "You were a nurse, charge nurse, Grant County Medical Center, Silver City, retired." She smoothed the strip of medical tape along the gauze and pressed it flat. "Now I work here." She said it without bitterness. It was simply the current fact, and she had learned in 11 months that bitterness was an energy expenditure she could not afford. Wade turned his coffee mug between both hands. He did not drink from it. He looked at the counter in front of him with the expression of a man working something carefully through. "That bike at the head of the line," he said after a while, "worth more than this building." "I know," she said. "You didn't know me." "No. So why?" Dot set down the roll of medical tape. She looked at him directly, the kind of direct, undefended look that takes decades to develop, that nurses either learn or they don't. The look that says, "I am going to tell you the truth because we are past the point where anything less is useful." "Because I need this job," she said, "and because those men were the kind who get away with things when nobody says anything. I have a very limited tolerance for that." She paused. "And because it was the right thing to do. Those reasons are not in conflict." Wade looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached into his cut and withdrew his wallet. He unfolded bills and set them on the counter beside his empty mug without counting them aloud. "For the meal," he said, "and the rest." Dot looked at the bills. There were several of them. More than the meal warranted by a significant margin. "I can't accept," she began. "You bled from my machine," he said. His voice was even and patient. "In our world, that means something." He did not elaborate on what it meant or why it meant what it meant. He stood, pulled his cut straight, and nodded once, the particular nod that closes a conversation without hostility. "Get that arm looked at properly." He walked toward the door. At the threshold, he paused without fully turning. "What's the boy's name?" he said. Dot blinked at the shift. "Danny." A pause, brief, almost imperceptible, the length of a single breath held and released. Then Wade went through the door and back into the cold New Mexico night. Through the plate glass, Dot watched him mount the custom cruiser at the head of the line, the one the thief had been crouching beside. The engine turned over with a deep, rolling thunder. 11 machines followed one after another, and then they were moving, sweeping out of the lot in the same rolling formation they had arrived in, the sound of them diminishing into the darkness of Highway 180 until there was nothing left but the wind and the hum of the fluorescent tubes. Dot stood at the counter. She looked at the bills. She counted them. $420. She stood there for a long time. The wind rattled the aluminum door in its frame. From the back booth, Danny turned over in his sleep and made a small, unconscious sound. Not distress, just the natural shifting of a child settling deeper. Dot listened until his breathing steadied again. Then she picked up the money and held it in both hands. She did not cry. She was not a woman who cried easily, and she did not cry now. But she stood there in the buzzing, discordant light of Roy's diner and held $420 more than 2 weeks of what Roy paid her, and she felt something move through her chest that she did not have a precise clinical name for. Not gratitude exactly, something older and more complicated than gratitude. The feeling of being seen, without asking, by someone who owed you nothing and acted anyway. After a while, she folded the bills carefully and put them in her apron pocket. She went to start a fresh pot of coffee. She had 4 more hours on her shift. Danny needed his medication refilled next week. Dr. Fenwick's next appointment was in 6 weeks. The front left tire on the Civic was wearing thin. There was still an enormous amount of work to do. But standing in the empty diner, in the deep silence of a New Mexico night, Dot Wren felt something she recognized from an earlier version of herself. The version that had faced 31 years of impossible rooms and kept her voice level in every single one. She felt like she might be equal to what was coming. She did not know standing there that the man named Wade had pulled his formation over at a gravel turnout 3 miles west on 180 and sat on his idling machine for nearly 4 minutes without speaking. She did not know that he had reached into the inner breast pocket of his cut and held something small and worn in his palm for those 4 minutes before putting it back. She did not know that when his vice president, a man named Garrett Pierce Crow, to the club had finally said quietly, "Wade, you good?" He had taken a long breath and said, "Yeah, keep moving." She did not know any of this. But the $420 was real, and Danny was breathing steadily in the back booth, and the coffee was fresh, and she had 4 hours left. She wiped down the counter. She started again. The week that followed moved with the grinding, determined forward motion of Dot's daily life, a rhythm so compressed and precise that there was very little room in it for reflection, which she had come to understand was probably a feature rather than a flaw. Wake at 7, get Danny up and fed, drive him to Deming Elementary in the Civic that was in its 12th year and showing every month of it. Home to sleep until 2 in the afternoon. Wake housework. Danny. Home at 3:30. Dinner. Homework. The evening medication, the metoprolol, the aspirin, the ritual of the pill cup and the glass of water. And Danny's uncomplaining acceptance of all of it, which was either a sign of unusual maturity or the saddest thing she knew. And she had decided long ago to call it the former. Dishes. Shower. Back to the diner by 11. The $420 she had added to the mason jar on her dresser, the one separate from the diner jar, the one she'd started as Danny's medical fund, and watched accumulate with agonizing slowness across the months. 4 months of careful saving had brought it to $1,100. With Wade's money, it was now $1,520. She allowed herself to look at the figure for exactly 30 seconds each morning before she slept. Then she put the lid back on. Roy Steck came in on Friday afternoon for his weekly walkthrough. He was 53, a thick, self-satisfied man with small eyes set close together above a nose that had been broken at some point and not properly reset, giving his face a slightly off-center quality that matched Dot had come to feel, the slightly off-center quality of everything he operated. He drove a late-model pickup, silver, always clean. He wore Western shirts with pearl snaps. He smelled of a cheap cologne that was too sweet and too persistent, the kind of smell that occupied a room after the person wearing it had left. Roy walked the counter. He checked the register tape. He lifted the mason jar, peered inside, set it down. He walked to the back and spent several minutes in the office that Dot had never been invited into and had not asked about because asking about it had not yet been the right move. When he came back out, he dropped a folded 20 on the counter in front of her. Dot looked at it. "Roy," she said, "how much was in the jar this week?" Roy smiled. It was a practiced smile, easy, warm, designed to discourage the next question. "Slow week, Dot. Barely covered overhead." Dot had been keeping her own count. She had noted in the small spiral notebook she carried in her apron pocket every tip she observed being placed, every table she cleared, every dollar she watched land on the laminate. Her count for the week, conservative and excluding anything she may have missed, was $230 above and beyond the meal charges. She knew this number. She had it written down. She looked at the 20 on the counter. She picked it up. She put it in her apron. She said, "Thank you, Roy," and turned back to the coffee station. Because confronting Roy Steck now, without complete documentation, without a plan, without understanding the full shape of what she was dealing with, would be satisfying for approximately 30 seconds and consequential for considerably longer. She was a nurse. She had spent 3 decades learning to distinguish between the symptom and the disease, between the intervention that felt good and the intervention that actually worked. She would wait. She would document. She would understand the situation before she acted on it. She was, after all, the woman who had walked into a dark parking lot with a piece of rebar at 2 in the morning. She was not afraid of Roy Steck, but she was patient. And patience, she had decided across 68 years, was a considerably more dangerous thing than courage, because courage was visible and patience was not. And the things that cannot be seen coming are the ones that arrive completely. On Monday night, 2 men came into the diner that she had not seen before. They arrived at 1:15 in the morning, not truckers, not travelers. Their clothes were clean and fitted in a way that did not belong on this stretch of highway at this hour. The younger one, dark-haired, went straight to Roy's back office without stopping at the counter. He moved with the familiarity of someone who had walked that route before. The older one, with a silver watch that caught the fluorescent light as he settled into the corner booth, sat down and ordered coffee. He did not drink it. They were in the office for 22 minutes. Dot watched the clock above the register. When the younger one came out, they left together without a word to her. No check, no transaction logged. Roy emerged from the office 3 minutes later, looking composed, but carrying a particular alertness behind his eyes, the residue of a high-stakes conversation, the elevated attention of a man who has just been told something that requires careful management. He told her to take her break. Dot took her break. She sat in the back hallway outside the office, which Roy had not fully latched, and she made no sound. She could not distinguish specific words. She could hear Roy's side of a phone call, not the other party, only Roy. She heard him say transfer 3 times. She heard a number she could not catch clearly, but which had the register of a large figure, the specific weight of something that does not get said casually. She heard him say Thursday. She heard him say, "It's handled," twice. The second repetition marginally more emphatic than the first, which meant whoever was on the other end had not been satisfied by the first. When she heard him move toward the door, she stood and walked to the water fountain at the end of the hall and bent over it. Roy came out, looked at her, said nothing, went back to the counter. Dot followed. She picked up her order pad. She noted the time in her spiral notebook. She wrote, 2 men, office, 22 minutes, transfer, Thursday, it's handled. She underlined Thursday. That was the beginning. The Iron Mercy MC came back on Wednesday night. She had not known they were coming. At 11:45, the lot was empty. At 11:58, the engines arrived, not 11 this time, but 7 pulling in with the same deliberate formation. Dot watched from behind the counter. Wade came through the door first. The same slight duck under the frame, the same systematic scan. His eyes found Danny in the back booth. The boy was doing his homework tonight, bent over a worksheet about the water cycle using the flashlight app on Dot's old phone, because the back booth's overhead bulb had burned out 2 weeks ago and Roy had not replaced it. And then found Dot behind the counter. He sat at the same stool. End of the counter, 2 seats from the mason jar. "Evening," she said. "Coffee," he said. Then after a pause that carried its own particular quality, "How's the arm?" Dot extended her right forearm briefly. The abrasion was healing cleanly. She had changed the dressing twice, kept it sterile, done what she knew to do with the automatic competence of 31 years. "Fine," she said. "Thank you for asking." She had made the stew again. A larger pot than she normally would because she had made the decision, without fully articulating it to herself, to be prepared on Wednesday nights going forward. She poured his coffee and poured for the others, and put in the order, and worked the shift the way she always worked it, steady and efficient and attentive. Partway through the meal, while the men were eating, and the low register of their conversation filled the diner with its particular warmth, Danny came up from the back booth with his drawing pad. He stood at the end of the counter and looked at the row of men with the open, cataloging attention of a boy who had decided without announcing the decision that these men were interesting. He looked at Wade specifically. Wade looked back. His face did what it did. It did not close down, did not warm, demonstrably simply attended with its full, careful weight. "Your scar," Danny said, "is on the wrong side in my drawing. I put it on the right, but it goes on the left. I was seeing it backwards like a mirror." "You drew my picture," Wade said. "Yeah, Grandma said it was good, but the scar is wrong." Danny considered this with the seriousness of a craftsman identifying an error that must be corrected. "Can I fix it?" Something moved Wade's face, the anterior state of something larger, the thing that comes before certain expressions in people who have learned to be very careful about showing them. "Sure," he said. Danny went back for the drawing pad. He returned and sat at the counter, 2 stools from Wade, and drew with the focused, self-contained concentration of a child doing something that genuinely mattered to him. Wade ate. He did not look at the drawing directly, but he did not move away. When Danny finished and held it up, the scar was correctly placed, in the face more accurately rendered for having been studied from 2 feet away. Wade looked at it. He looked at it for longer than the social situation strictly required. "That's good," he said. The same words he had used about the stew on the first night. Dot understood, hearing them a second time, that for this man these were not performative words. They were a precise verdict. Danny beamed with the uncomplicated delight of a child receiving honest acknowledgement from an adult who meant it. He took the drawing back to the booth. Wade returned to his coffee. Later, when the meal was done and the men were moving toward the door, Wade lingered on his stool a moment after the others. He set his payment on the counter. He looked at Dot. "You've worked here long," he said. Not quite a question. 11 months. "You like it." "I need it," Dot said. Which isn't the same thing. Something shifted behind his eyes. "No," he said quietly. "It isn't." He stood. The boy's father. Dot met his gaze. Gone. His mother too. Car accident 14 months ago. She said it plainly without the apologetic softening that obligates the listener to manage the speaker's grief. "He's mine now." Wade was quiet for a moment. Then, "He's good with a pencil." "He's good at most things he tries," Dot said. "He doesn't know that yet. He will." Wade moved toward the door. At the threshold, the pause she had noticed before the half-turn, the thing said into the space before leaving. "How much is the surgery?" The directness of it stopped her for a beat. 62,000, she said. "Minimum." A silence. "What's his doctor's name?" Wade said. "Fenwick. El Paso." Another brief pause. Then he went through the door. Dot watched through the glass as he walked to the cruiser at the head of the line and mounted it. She watched him sit for a moment before starting the engine, head down slightly, hands still on the tank. Then the engine turned over. The formation moved. The sound of them faded west on 180 until the night came back around the diner with its usual cold and silence. Dot stood at the window for a long time after they were gone. She was thinking about those two questions. How much is the surgery? What's his doctor's name? Not the questions of a man making conversation, the questions of a man who intended to do something with the answers. She wrote them in the notebook. She wrote the time. She looked at what she'd written. She went to check on Danny. His breathing was steady. His face in sleep had Carol's shape, the same jawline, the same faint crease at the corner of the eye. Dot stood over him for a moment and adjusted the sleeping bag and thought about the drawing pad under the dog pillow and the fact that Danny had noticed the scar on the wrong side and gone back to fix it because accuracy mattered to him, because he was the kind of child who cared about getting things right. He was his mother's child. He was her child now. She went back to the counter and got back to work. Roy called on Thursday morning when Dot had been asleep for exactly 3 hours. She surfaced fully on the second ring. 31 years of hospital shifts had trained the fog of interrupted sleep out of her completely, had built into her the reflex of immediate, clear wakefulness the moment a phone made any sound at any hour. Dot. Roy's voice was the voice he used when he had already made a decision and was calling to inform her of it rather than discuss it. "I'm going to need you off the schedule for a few days." Dot sat up. "What does that mean, Roy?" "Health inspector situation. I need the operation quieted down, the back cleared out. I'll call you when we're back up." "How many days?" "I don't know yet. End of next week, maybe." A pause. "You'll get your regular pay for the time." Regular pay. $20 a day. He thought this would satisfy her, which told her a considerable amount about what Roy thought of her, and even more about what Roy thought of himself. "All right," she said. "I'll wait for your call." She hung up. She sat on the edge of her bed in the thin gray light coming through the curtain. Through the wall, she could hear the particular settled silence of Danny deep in sleep, different in its quality from the lighter breathing of morning wakefulness. A sound she had learned to distinguish, the way you learn to distinguish anything you have listened to carefully enough and long enough. She sat for a moment with the phone in her hands. Then she dialed a number she had looked up 2 days ago and not yet used. It rang 4 times. A woman answered the New Mexico Department of Labor Wage and Hour Division. The office opened at 8. It was 8:03. "I have some questions," Dot said, "about minimum wage compliance in the treatment of gratuities under New Mexico state labor law." She did not know yet that this phone call and the information she was about to receive and the spiral notebook in her apron pocket with its careful columns of figures and times would become within 10 days one piece of evidence among several in a situation considerably larger and more dangerous than tip theft. She knew only that Roy Steck had been taking from her and that she was very tired of things being taken from her and that she had 31 years of experience keeping records. She asked her questions. She took her notes. She thanked the woman at the Wage and Hour Division and hung up. Then she went to make Danny's breakfast because he would be up in 40 minutes and he needed his metoprolol with food. And the fact that Roy Steck had just suspended her from her only source of income did not change the fact that Danny's medication went in at 7:45 every morning without exception, and the world, whatever it was arranging around her, was required to accommodate the schedule. She scrambled eggs. She made toast. She sliced a banana into rounds rather than lengthwise because that was how Danny liked it, a preference he had held since he was 4, and that she had never thought to question and never would. She set the pill cup beside the plate. She spent Thursday and Friday doing what she always did when the situation required it. She organized information. She laid the spiral notebook on the kitchen table after Danny went to school and went through every entry with care. 11 months of tip observations. 11 months of estimated shift revenue based on table counts and average checks she had calculated from the register receipts she could observe. The difference between what the mason jar should have contained and what Roy distributed each week. She was not an accountant, but she had managed a 30-bed ward for 11 years, which required a practical fluency in budget arithmetic that she had never lost and never would. Her conservative estimate of the total discrepancy across 11 months fell between $4,000 and $6,000. This was significant. This was, by the definitions she had found in the statutes, wage theft. This was something she could document, report, and pursue. She intended to pursue it. But as she worked through the numbers, she kept returning to Monday night. The dark-haired man who had walked directly to Roy's back office without pausing. The older man with the silver watch who had sat in the corner booth and ordered coffee he did not drink. The 22 minutes. The phone call heard through the unlatched door. Transfer. Thursday. It's handled. Wage theft was Roy's crime against her specifically. Whatever Roy was doing in that back office was something else. Something with a different scale. She did not know what it was yet. She knew only the shape of her ignorance, which was she had always believed the beginning of knowing. She needed more information before she acted. She wrote in the notebook Monday night, 2 men, office 22 minutes, transfer. Thursday, it's handled. She underlined Thursday twice. That had been 4 days ago. She closed the notebook. She looked at the clock. It was 3:15. Danny would be home in 15 minutes. She stood at the front window and looked out at the quiet street, the sun-bleached residential block where her small adobe house sat between a retired teacher's place on one side and a vacant lot on the other. The kind of neighborhood that had been tired for a long time. The kind of tired that sets in when money moves elsewhere and doesn't come back. She watched the block and thought about what transfer meant, and what it's handled meant, and what 2 well-dressed men doing backroom business in a highway diner at 1:15 in the morning meant. She was 68 years old. She had lived in this town for 11 years. She had kept people alive in impossible rooms for 3 decades. She was not the kind of woman who waited passively for understanding to find her. She was the kind who went looking for it. But she was also, first and before anything, the kind who waited for Danny to get home. The school bus rounded the corner at 3:28. She watched Danny climb down the steps, careful the way he was always careful on stairs because Fenwick had told him to take them slowly. A restriction Danny observed without complaint or drama, which was either maturity or the saddest thing she knew. And she had decided long ago it was the former, and would not revisit the decision. He had his backpack and his Cardinal sweatshirt, and he was looking at something in his hand, a folded piece of paper, a drawing, the kind of thing 9-year-olds carry home from school, with the casual, unself-conscious pride of people who have not yet learned that their work will not always be received this way. He looked up and saw her at the window. He raised the paper. She raised her hand. She would go back to the notebook tonight. She would go back to the question of Thursday and transfer and what Roy Steck was doing in his back office. She would work it through. That was what she did. But first, Danny was home, and the afternoon was theirs. And the light through the kitchen window was the long, flat gold of late afternoon in the high desert in early spring. And she had everything for the stew, and Danny would want to help cut the onions, because he always wanted to help cut the onions, and the evening was going to be good. She went to unlock the door. "Hey, Grandma," Danny said, holding up the drawing. It was a motorcycle, blocky, earnest, proportionally careful, the handling of perspective noticeably better than his drawings from 2 months ago. "I drew the guy from the diner. I tried to get the bike right." Dot looked at the drawing. Then she looked at the boy holding it. "That's very good," she said. He came inside. The door closed behind him. The afternoon settled into the house with its familiar sounds and its familiar light. And outside in the high desert, the sun was still 2 hours from the mountains, and somewhere on Highway 180, a man named Wade Cobb was riding west, towards something she did not yet know about, but was already in the process of understanding. Roy called on Sunday evening. His voice had the specific quality of a man performing normality with slightly too much effort, the calm that is constructed rather than felt, audible to anyone who has spent decades listening to the gap between what people say and what their voice does underneath the saying of it. "Dot, good news. Inspection cleared. We're back to full operation Wednesday night. You good to come in at 11? "Of course," she said. Same as always. A pause that lasted half a second too long. "Everything good on your end?" "Everything's fine, Roy," she said. "I'll see you Wednesday." She hung up and sat at the kitchen table. She had told herself in the days since Friday to document everything and act through proper channels and not to let impatience collapse the timeline she was building. The proper channels existed. She would use them. But first she needed to understand completely what she was inside. She thought about the 2 well-dressed men. She thought about Roy's office and the unlocked back exit and the rubber wedge that kept it propped open, which she had noticed in October and noted in the spiral notebook because it was the kind of detail that did not quite fit the explanation of ventilation. And she had learned in 31 years to note the things that did not fit. She wrote in the notebook, Roy confirmed Wednesday. Back to regular schedule. She thought about Thursday. She thought about, it's handled. She closed the notebook and went to check on Danny. He was at his desk drawing. Not the motorcycle this time. He had moved on to a scene. The whole interior of the diner, the counter and the stools and the booths, all of the men arranged around it, rendered with the careful spatial accuracy of a child who paid close and sincere attention to how things were organized in the world. He looked up when she came to the doorway. "How many people are in the club?" he said. "I don't know exactly," Dot said. "More than 11. Danny looked at his drawing. He made a small adjustment to a figure at the counter. "Wade doesn't talk much," he said, not as a criticism, as an observation. "No," Dot agreed. "He doesn't, but when he says things he means them," Danny said. Dot looked at her grandson for a moment. "Yes," she said. "I've noticed that too." Danny went back to his drawing. She stood in the doorway a moment longer, watching him work, and thought about a man who had asked for Danny's cardiologist's name the way you ask for a coordinate when you are mapping something. She went back to the kitchen. She set the table for dinner. She had 3 days until Wednesday. She would use them. On Monday night, Dot arrived at the diner at 11, as usual. Roy was behind the counter when she came in, which was unusual. He normally did his afternoon walkthrough and left before the graveyard shift started. He looked at her with the same managed ease he always presented, and she showed him the 68-year-old woman who was tired and grateful for the work, and not thinking too hard about anything beyond the next table. She had played this role for 11 months. She was very good at it. "Good to have you back," Roy said. "Good to be back," she said. He left at 11:30. She made coffee. She noted the time. At 1:17 in the morning, headlights swept into the lot. Not motorcycles. A large black SUV, clean moving with deliberate slowness, into a parking position at the far end of the lot, rather than directly in front of the entrance. Out-of-state plates. Dot noted them in her notebook before she had consciously decided to. Two men got out. Neither was the same as the men from last Monday. Different faces, same register. Contained, well-dressed for the hour, carrying themselves with the practiced confidence of people who were accustomed to back rooms. The younger one went directly to Roy's office. The older one, heavy-set, with a quality leather jacket that cost more than Dot made in a month, sat in the corner booth. He ordered coffee. Dot poured it. He did not look at her directly, the practiced non-attention of someone who had decided that certain people did not require registration. She noted this too. She was at the coffee station when she heard a sound from the direction of the back hallway. She turned. Danny was standing at the end of the counter. He was in his pajamas, the ones with the small planets on them that he wore when he stayed at Patrice's, which Patrice had apparently sent him in tonight, and he was standing there with the blank, unanchored expression of a child who has been woken by something and has not yet decided how to process being awake. He should not have been there. Dot had arranged for him to stay at Patrice's. She reconstructed it later, Patrice's old truck starting trouble on a cold night, not wanting to call Dot at work, driving Danny over herself, with an instruction to go straight to the back booth and sleep. Danny had done this and then had gotten up to find the bathroom. All of that was later. What Dot saw now was her 9-year-old grandson in planet pajamas, standing 12 feet from a man whose presence in this diner at 1 in the morning was connected to something she had not yet fully understood. And the office door was ajar, and Danny was looking down the hallway toward the light under it. Dot moved. Not quickly would draw attention, but with the deliberate, unhurried authority she had learned from years of managing ward crises. She walked to the end of the counter and put her hands on Danny's shoulders and steered him gently but completely toward the back booth. "Back here," she said, voice low. "Get your pillow." "I needed the bathroom," Danny said. "I know. Back booth first." She got him settled. She pulled the sleeping bag up. She glanced at the corner booth. The man with the leather jacket was looking at his phone. He had not, as far as Dot could determine, looked up. She walked Danny to the bathroom herself and waited outside and walked him back and tucked the sleeping bag and stood until his breathing slowed back into sleep. Then she returned to the counter. The young man came out of the office at 1:54. He and the older man left without speaking to each other or to Dot, the practiced anonymity of people who had been instructed to conduct themselves as though the transaction had not occurred. Roy came out of the office at 2:01. He told her to take her break. She went out the back door and stood in the cold desert air and called a number she had found 3 days ago in her paper address book, Deputy Cal Briggs, Luna County Sheriff's Office. The man who had sent her a card when she retired from Grant County Medical, after his accident patient had survived because of her team's work. She got his voicemail. She left a careful, precise message, dates, times, the out-of-state plates she had noted, a description of the two men, a description of Monday's two men, the words transfer, and Thursday, and it's handled, heard through an unlatched door. She read from the notebook. She thanked him and hung up. She stood in the cold for a moment. The Florida mountains to the east were dark shapes against a sky dense with stars. The desert smelled of cold rock and the dry sage that grew in the margin north of the building. She thought about Danny in planet pajamas at the end of the counter. She thought about the corner booth and the leather jacket and the phone. She thought about the word that kept recurring in everything she'd observed, handled. She went back inside. She said nothing to Roy. She finished the shift. She checked on Danny 4 times before dawn, and each time his chest rose and fell in the steady, reliable rhythm that she monitored with the whole of her attention as she had monitored it every night for 11 months, as she would monitor it for every night remaining to her. She drove home in the early light. She did not sleep well. She did not expect to. Cal Briggs called back Friday afternoon. "The plate you gave me," he said, "it's connected to a shell company incorporated in Arizona. That company connects through two intermediary entities to a money laundering investigation the Albuquerque FBI field office has had open for 14 months. He paused. Mrs. Ren Roy Steck's diner is one of 4 businesses they've had under passive surveillance as potential laundering fronts. They've been building the case slowly. Your documentation, the dates, the pattern of Monday night visits, the observed regularity, fills a gap in their timeline. Specifically, they didn't have physical placement evidence for those visits. My notebook, Dot said. Your notebook, he confirmed. They want to talk to you, in person. Las Cruces field office, Monday morning. A pause. What about Danny? Bring him. They'll accommodate. She was quiet for a moment. Cal, she said. The phrase I heard through the office door. The old woman. Keep it that way. She let the sentence sit. Does that affect my safety assessment? A longer pause than she wanted. I'm going to have a patrol unit do drive-bys on your street tonight and tomorrow, just as a precaution. I see, she said. You did exactly the right thing, he said. I mean that. She thanked him and hung up. She sat at the kitchen table with her hands flat on the wood and looked at the wall above the kitchen window where Carol had tacked up a small watercolor of a roadrunner that Danny had made at age 7, and that had been transferred along with a number of other things from Carol's refrigerator door to Dot's wall in the weeks after the accident. She looked at it for a while. The old woman. Keep it that way. Roy Steck had told someone, a person connected to a federal investigation, connected to shell companies in Arizona, connected to money she could not trace to a source, that she didn't know anything. And that person had said to keep it that way. They had decided she was manageable, that the 68-year-old woman working the graveyard shift was not a problem. They were wrong. But they did not know they were wrong. And until she was in a room with the FBI on Monday morning, it was in her interest for them to continue not knowing. She went to Danny's room. He was reading the second book in the Deep Sea series, the one about hydrothermal vents and the organisms that lived around them, in total darkness, surviving on chemistry rather than sunlight. He looked up. Grandma, he said, did you know there are worms down there that are basically immortal? Like they just keep living because nothing can really kill them. I did not know that, Dot said. They live around the vents where it's hot and everything is poisonous, he said. And they just figured out how to make that work for them. Dot looked at her grandson. That is an extremely useful thing to know, she said. Danny looked pleased. He went back to his book. She stood in the doorway for a moment longer. Then she went to call Sandra Pruitt, the labor attorney in Las Cruces, and leave a message about next steps on the wage theft documentation. 3 days to Monday, she would use every one of them. On Saturday evening, Dot's phone rang with an unknown number. She answered it. Mrs. Wren, a man's voice low and level. Not a question, a confirmation. Mr. Cobb, she said. A brief pause, the kind that happens when a response arrives in a register that slightly recalibrates something. You know who this is, he said. I know your first name and your club and your motorcycle, she said. I'm a nurse. I pay attention to details. Another pause. You need to tell me something about the diner. Dot sat very still at the kitchen table. Why? Because someone I trust told me what they saw coming in and out of that back lot on Monday nights. And because I found out something today about Roy Steck. A pause. The boy was there Monday night. The cold moved through her precisely. How do you know that? A trucker who comes through on Tuesday mornings mentioned it in passing. He said he saw a kid in planet pajamas going to the bathroom. He was just making conversation. He didn't think it was significant. Another pause with more weight in it. Was he seen? The man in the corner booth had his eyes on his phone, Dot said. I got Danny out within 2 minutes. I believe he was not seen. You believe, Wade said. Yes, she said. I believe. not certify. The quality of the silence between them shifted. I called the Luna County Sheriff's Office Friday, Dot said. Deputy Cal Briggs. He connected me to the FBI field office in Albuquerque. I'm going to their Las Cruces office Monday morning. A longer silence. You have documentation, he said. 11 months of it. Dates, times, observed transactions. A partial recording of a phone call, an out-of-state license plate. A pause. You've been building this for 11 months. I've been building the wage theft documentation for 11 months, Dot said. I've been building this for 3 weeks. It turns out they're the same thing. Roy Steck is the center of all of it. She heard something from him, not a word but a sound in the register of a man, recalibrating an estimation that had already been considerably higher than where it had started. Monday morning, he said, 8 o'clock, Dot. The first time he had used her name, without her giving it to him, in that moment. If anything changes before Monday, if anything feels different, if anything seems wrong, you call me. I don't have your number, she said. You have it now, he said. It came through when I called. Save it. She looked at her screen. He was right. All right, she said. Danny doesn't go out, Wade said. Not until after Monday. I've already decided that. Good. A pause. Then in a register slightly separate from the operational part of the conversation. The stew. Wednesday night. Same recipe, you make it work. It was such a complete pivot that it took her a moment to follow. Yes, she said. My mother's recipe. My mother made something like it, he said, a long time ago. He said it simply the way he said things that lived too deep in him to stay entirely silent, not for effect, not as an opening, just as a fact he was acknowledging to himself as much as to her. Get some sleep tonight. He hung up. Dot held the phone. Outside, the desert had gone from gray to the deep, particular dark of a starlit Saturday in New Mexico. Through the window above the sink, she could see the first stars appearing over the Florida mountains. The same stars she had been watching from this window for 11 years, indifferent to all of it. She saved his number in her address book. She thought about what he had said about his mother's recipe. She thought about the fact that he had known about Danny being at the diner on Monday night before she mentioned it, and that his first question had been whether Danny had been seen. She thought about the photograph, the small worn thing she had watched him hold in the diner that first night that he had put back in his breast pocket before she could see it clearly. She went to check on Danny. Sound asleep, the deep sea book closed on the nightstand. His breathing was steady, and his face in sleep had Carol's shape. The same jaw, the same faint crease at the corner of the eye that Dot had been looking at for 40 years in her daughter's face and was now looking at in her daughter's son. She adjusted his blanket. She stood for a moment. Then she went back to the kitchen and wrote Wade's number on the inside back cover of her paper address book, the one Carol had given her as a joke about her refusal to put contacts in her phone, and which had become, in the years since Carol's death, one of the objects she valued most, precisely because it was a joke Carol had made. She made tea. She sat at the kitchen table. She was frightened. She permitted herself to be frightened because pretending otherwise to yourself was how you made mistakes, the clinical lesson learned across decades of watching people choose false calm over accurate fear and pay for the choice with errors they could not afford. She acknowledged the fear. She set it where it could inform rather than govern. Then she thought through the situation systematically, the way she would have thought through a complex case on the ward. What she knew, what she didn't know, what the next correct action was, and what resources she had available. What she knew, Roy Steck was running a money laundering operation through the diner. The FBI in Albuquerque had been building a case for 14 months. Her documentation filled a gap. She was going in Monday morning. What she didn't know exactly who Roy was working for and what they would do if they decided the old woman had become a problem. What the next correct action was, go in, Monday, give her statement, let the proper channels accelerate the timeline. What resources she had, Cal Briggs. Agent Hartley, whose name she had gotten from Cal. The notebook. the recording she had made without realizing she was making it on her phone, and a number in the back of her address book that belonged to a man who had asked how much the surgery cost and what the cardiologist's name was before he had ever told her what he intended to do with the answers. She was 68 years old. She had faced impossible rooms for 31 years. She had walked into a dark parking lot with a piece of rebar. She was not done. She was not anywhere near done. She drank her tea. She went to bed. She slept. The FBI field office in Las Cruces was a low brick building in a business park near Interstate 25, indistinguishable from the insurance offices and medical billing companies on either side of it, which Dot supposed was precisely the point. The special agent who met them in the lobby was a woman named Hartley, mid-40s, brown hair worn practically with the manner of someone who had spent years listening to people describe things they had witnessed, and who had learned that judgment and skepticism made people stop talking before they had finished. Danny sat in a waiting area with a junior agent who produced with professional cheerfulness a coloring book and a set of markers. Danny accepted them with impeccable 9-year-old politeness, looked at the designs inside with the measured assessment of a child who had been coloring since age 2, and understood immediately that this was a basic retail coloring book with simple outlines. He colored it anyway because he was Danny, because he was polite, and because the careful filling in of outlines was the kind of orderly task that his hands found natural, regardless of the artistic ambition of the material. Agent Hartley took Dot to a conference room and listened to her for 45 minutes. She asked precise questions in the right places and did not ask imprecise questions at all. She looked at the photographs on Dot's phone, the spiral notebook pages, 11 months of columns, with an expression of controlled, professional satisfaction. Mrs. Wren, Hartley said at the end, "Your documentation is exceptional." "I was a charge nurse for 31 years, Dot said. "Charts matter." Hartley almost smiled. "Not quite. The license plate you observed on Monday, we've had that vehicle in phone records, but we haven't had physical location placement. This confirms the Deming site as an active node in the operation during the period in question." She paused. "We were planning for June. We're moving the timeline up. We're looking at the end of this month now." "What does that mean for Roy Steck?" Dot said. "It means he's going to have a very difficult April," Hartley said. "And for my grandson and me." Hartley looked at her steadily. "We're going to ask you to maintain your normal patterns for approximately 1 week. Come in Wednesday night if Roy calls you back. Behave as if nothing has changed. We'll have surveillance on both the building and your home address." She paused. "This is not without risk. I want to be direct with you about that." "I understand risk," Dot said. "I managed a hospital ward for 11 years. Before that, I worked the floor for 20 more. "Yes," Hartley said. "I can see that." She looked at the notebook photographs again. Then, "Mrs. Wren, one more question. Is there anyone in your life outside official channels who provides a meaningful safety buffer? Someone with physical presence and a clear motivation to act on your behalf?" Dot thought about iron gray hair and storm weather eyes and a custom motorcycle at the head of a line in a cold New Mexico parking lot. "Yes," she said, "there is. Keep that relationship active," Hartley said. Dot drove home through the wide, flat morning of the Chihuahuan Basin. Danny in the passenger seat eating a granola bar one of the agents had given him. The desert opened up on both sides of I-10, immense and indifferent, and in the particular light of a clear April morning, genuinely beautiful. "Grandma," Danny said, looking out the windshield. That building, what was it really?" Dot drove. "Federal office," she said. "I had to give them some information about work." Danny was quiet for a moment. "Is Roy in trouble?" She glanced at him. "Why do you ask that?" "Because," Danny said with the calm certainty of a child stating an observable fact, "he's the kind of person who takes things. You can tell by how he looks at the jar." He paused, watching the desert go by. "You noticed it too. I could tell by how you look at him when he comes in." Dot was quiet for a long moment. "You notice that," she said. Yeah, he said. He looked out the window. I noticed it in like month 2. He said this without particular emphasis, the way he said most things that were simply true. He watched the desert. I didn't say anything because I didn't know what you were going to do about it, and I didn't want to make it harder. Dot drove. The miles went by in the long, clean silence of the high desert in the morning. Danny, she said after a while, you are your mother's son. He looked over at her. Is that good? That is the best thing I know how to say to you, she said. He thought about this. He nodded once with the deliberate seriousness of a child accepting a significant statement. He looked back out the window. He finished his granola bar. They drove home. Wednesday came. Dot drove in at 11. The diner looked exactly as it always had. The bleached sign, the humming lights, the cracked asphalt. Roy was there when she arrived, which was still unusual, and she read nothing into it and showed him nothing, except a woman who was glad to be back at work. He left at 11:30. She made coffee. She noted the time. At 11:51, the engines arrived. Wade came through the door with 8 men behind him. He sat at the same stool. He looked at her, a single direct look that carried several things at once, in the compressed language of people who communicate without requiring decoration. She looked back at him, a small nod. He sat. She poured his coffee. She put in the order. The diner found its Wednesday rhythm. Danny was in the back booth with his drawing pad, working on a new version of the diner scene, more detailed than the last one. The spatial relationships, more accurately rendered, the quality of the fluorescent light attempted in careful crosshatching. At some point, without announcement, he came and sat at the counter and drew from life. Wade glanced at the drawing pad once. Then he glanced at Dot. Then he turned back to his coffee and said into it quietly enough that it didn't carry to the other men. I called Fenwick. Dot stopped. She was refilling his mug, and she simply stopped the pot suspended. Dr. Fenwick, she said, in El Paso. Yes? He looked at the counter. Last Thursday, I spoke with his office. You called my grandson's cardiologist. Yes. She set the pot down. She waited. She had spent 31 years learning that the thing to do when someone was about to tell you something important was to provide them with silence to tell it in. There's a surgical team in Houston, Wade said, Texas Children's Hospital, a pediatric cardiac surgeon named Patel. He's done the specific repair Danny needs 47 times in children Danny's age with the same presentation. Fenwick knows of him. Fenwick says he's the most experienced in the country for this procedure. He turned the mug. I spoke with Patel's coordinator. Dot was very still. There's a slot that opened up in late May. Another family had to defer. The coordinator said it's available. A pause. Fenwick's referral is what triggers the scheduling. The coordinator said Fenwick would provide it without hesitation based on his own assessment that Danny should be seen by a specialist of this level. He looked at the counter. She's right, he will. Dot did not speak for a moment. She was calculating not the cost not yet, but the reality of what she was hearing. The specificity of it. A name, a number, a coordinator, a slot. The specific completed shape of something that was not a vague gesture, but a series of calls that had been made and confirmed. Wade, she said, how much does this cost? It doesn't matter, he said. It matters to me, she said. It matters considerably to me. He looked up. His storm gray eyes met hers with the full direct weight of a man who had stopped managing the distance between himself and what he was saying. I know it matters to you, he said, but it doesn't change anything. The coordinator has a payment on file. A pause. It's handled. Those 2 words. It's handled. The same words she had heard through Roy's unlatched office door, written in her spiral notebook, carried for weeks as evidence of something corrupt and dangerous. And now here they were in this man's mouth in this context. And the difference was so total and so complete that she had to look away from him for a moment. She turned toward the coffee station. She put her back to the counter. She stood there for a specific measured number of seconds and allowed herself to feel what she was feeling. The weight that had been on her for 11 months. The specific density of a number that had seemed to be perpetually receding, shifting for a moment, shifting in a way that was real, not charity, not pity, something that came from a place she did not yet fully understand, but that she recognized. In the particular way she recognized things that had been formed under long and serious pressure. She turned back. "Why?" she said. She said it the way she had said it in the parking lot 3 weeks ago, plainly, without softness, because she needed the real answer, and soft questions produced approximate answers. Wade was quiet for a moment. Then he reached into the inner breast pocket of his cut. He set something on the counter between them. A photograph, small, worn at the edges, creased along one corner, with the particular crease of something that has been folded and unfolded many times across many years. A boy perhaps 8 or 9 years old, dark-haired, sitting on a motorcycle that was much too large for him, his face split open in an enormous, uncomplicated grin, both hands gripping the handlebars with the cheerful overconfidence of a child who is not yet aware of his own smallness. Dot looked at the photograph. She looked at it for a long time. "His name was Tommy," Wade said. His voice was the same as always, low level, doing the same work it always did. Underneath it, something that had been held under controlled pressure for a very long time, showing itself in the way that pressurized things show themselves, not through a rupture, but through the particular tension of a surface that is choosing to hold rather than release, and that costs something to maintain. He was 9 years old. He had a bicuspid aortic valve, same as Danny. Dot did not speak. 1996, Wade said. Tucson. I was 33. I had nothing, no insurance, no money to speak of. I'd been with the club 8 years, riding hard and carrying parts, and thinking I had time to figure out the rest. He stopped. When he continued, his voice was unchanged in its register, but there was something below the surface of it that was doing work she could feel, even across the counter. The cardiologist in Tucson told us Tommy needed surgery. He said we had time. A window. 12 to 18 months was what he said. He looked at the photograph lying on the laminate between them. I spent 8 months trying to pull together the money. I waited because I was afraid of the bill. I kept thinking I'd have it in another month, and then another month. He stopped again. The diner was quiet. The fluorescent tubes hummed their discordant hum. From the back booth, the soft sound of Danny's pencil moving across paper. He had an acute event at home, Wade said. Not at the hospital. At home on a Tuesday morning. By the time the ambulance came, it was already... He stopped. He looked at the counter. He died in the waiting room. I had him for 9 years, and I let him die because I was broke and scared, and I kept telling myself there was more time than there was. Dot looked at the man across the counter from her. She looked at the scar along his jaw, and the gray in his hair, and the storm weather eyes that were doing right now the work of holding 28 years of a door that had closed on a Tuesday morning in a hospital waiting room outside Tucson. "I'm sorry," she said. She said it plainly as she had said it to families for 3 decades. Not with the apologetic softening that makes grief into a social transaction, but with the direct, clean acknowledgement of someone who understood the specific weight of what was being described. Wade looked at the photograph for a moment longer. Then he picked it up and put it back in his breast pocket with the careful, practiced motion of a man who has done this 10,000 times. He picked up his coffee. "The coordinator's name is Renata Wells," he said, returning to the operational clarity that was his natural mode, the mode in which things could be acted on. "Texas Children's Houston. Danny will need blood work done at Fenwick's before they can finalize the surgical plan. Fenwick's office is expecting your call." He drank. "Light breakfast before the blood work. Nothing heavy." "You've already coordinated with Fenwick," she said. "I wanted to make sure the slot was real before I told you," he said. Not as an apology, as a statement about what kind of man he was. One who did not deal in half-completed things, who had learned 28 years ago in the hardest way available what it cost to offer hope that hadn't been confirmed. Dot picked up the coffee pot. She refilled his mug and the mugs of the 8 men down the counter who had been eating and talking in the register of people who understood which conversations were not theirs. She went to the kitchen pass-through and leaned her back against the wall beside it and looked at the ceiling for a moment. The fluorescent tube above the kitchen was humming at a slightly different pitch than the ones in the front. She had noticed this in October. Roy had never fixed it. After this week, Roy would not be fixing anything in this building. She thought about Danny's face when he came through the door after school with his drawing pad and his Cardinals sweatshirt. She thought about Fenwick's voice on the phone saying, "Stable," and the word "stable" living in its narrow valley. She thought about 11 months of $20 Fridays and a mason jar moving too slowly toward a number that had seemed to be receding as fast as she approached it. She thought about Tommy, 9 years old, a bicycle valve in a 12 to 18-month window, and a father who had waited 1 month too long because he was scared and broke and kept thinking there was more time. She straightened. She went back to the counter. "I'll call Fenwick in the morning," she said. Wade nodded. "Wade." She waited until he looked at her. "Thank you." He looked at her for a long moment with the direct, undeflected gaze of a man who has finally stopped managing the distance between himself and certain things. Then he looked down at his mug. He said, "The stew is good." She understood this. She understood that for this man, in this language, in the particular compressed economy of what he was able to offer, this was the complete expression. The stew is good meant, I am here and this is real, and I am not going to look away from any of it. "Yes," she said, "it is." She picked up her rag. She got back to work. It was at 2:17 in the morning that Roy came back. She heard his truck in the employee lot, the specific sound of the F-250's engine she had learned to identify across 11 months of closing shifts, the way you learn any sound you hear with enough regularity, the way the body files away information it may need. She heard him come in through the rear entrance, past the utility closet, past the back exit with its rubber wedge. She moved to the far end of the counter with the unhurried motion of a woman doing her regular closing work. She took her phone from her apron pocket and pressed the record button without looking at it, a motion she had practiced 3 times in the last week, standing at her kitchen counter at home until she could do it without looking, the same way she had learned years ago to start an IV without looking at the vein after the first stick. She heard Roy's voice from the office, compressed, controlled, working hard to stay low. She could not make out words, only tone, and the tone was escalating. A man managing a situation that was not managing as smoothly as he needed it to. Then Roy's office door opened with a sharp bang against its stop, and she heard him in the hallway. His voice was no longer compressed. "That's not how this works," he said, into the phone, not to her. "I've kept this clean for 4 years. You don't just..." A pause. No, we're not doing that." The self-satisfied flatness was entirely gone from his voice, now stripped away, and what was underneath it was ordinary human fear, the kind that comes when a man realizes the arrangement he thought he controlled has started operating on terms he did not agree to. "She doesn't know anything I already told you. She's an old woman who works the counter. You leave her out of..." A longer silence, then the sound of him moving. Roy came through the kitchen door into the dining room and stopped. He looked at Dot. She looked at him. Roy's face did something complicated, several rapid assessments colliding simultaneously. He had been overheard. He had been moments ago arguing on behalf of someone he had dismissed as harmless, and that person was now standing at the far end of his counter, looking back at him in a way that was not harmless, in a way that had perhaps never been harmless. "Dot," he said. His voice had found a new register, not the managing tone of an employer, not the easy warmth of a man who thought he controlled the room, but something simpler and worse. The voice of a man who has just realized he does not know what he is dealing with. "Roy," she said, "how long have you been standing there?" "Long enough," she said, which was not specific enough to be incriminating and not vague enough to be reassuring. Both of those qualities were intentional. Roy looked at her. He looked at her phone on the counter face down. He had no way of knowing whether it was recording. His expression was doing the work of a man trying to calculate what she knew without asking, because asking would confirm that there was something she might know. "Go home, Dot," he said. "I'll close up. We're done early tonight." "All right," she said. She picked up her phone. She picked up her apron. She walked to the door with the unhurried movement of a woman who has done nothing wrong and knows it, and has nothing to hide and knows that too. She pushed through the glass door into the cold parking lot air. She walked to the Civic. She got in. She drove to the end of the lot. She stopped. She took out her phone. She called Cal Briggs's personal number. He answered in 2 rings. "I have an audio recording from tonight," she said. "Roy came in through the back. He was on the phone. I have his voice." She paused. "I'm sending you the file." She sent it. Then she called the second number, the one in the back of her address book. Wade answered on the first ring. "Roy came back to the diner," she said. "He was on the phone with someone. I have it recorded. He argued against something being done about me, I believe. He said she doesn't know anything." She paused. "Cal Briggs has the recording, and I think whatever Roy's handlers have been planning for Thursday has moved up." "Where are you right now?" Wade said. "In the parking lot. In my car." "Drive away from the diner," he said immediately. "Drive home. Lock the doors." A pause she heard in the background. The unmistakable sound of motorcycle engines turning over. Not just one, several. "Don't leave the house until I call you." "Cal has everything," she said. "Good. Go home, Dot. I'll be on your street in 40 minutes. She drove home at the speed limit because speeding drew attention, and she did not want attention. She wanted distance and walls and time to think. She got home. She locked the door. She sat at the kitchen table in the dark and looked at the phone in her hands and thought about Roy's voice saying she doesn't know anything, and the voice on the other end of the call that had not been satisfied by this. She was frightened. She permitted herself to be frightened. Fear was information. 38 minutes after she got home, a motorcycle turned onto her street. Then a second. Through the front window, she could see 2 Iron Mercy bikes on the curb, not Wade's 2 others, large men sitting in patient, unhurried stillness in the saddles, with the particular quality of people who have been asked to be somewhere and have decided they are going to be there completely. 4 minutes after that, her phone rang. "We're outside," Wade said. "My guys will stay until morning. I'm 10 minutes out. Cal called me. The FBI has your recording. Hartley is moving the arrest to tomorrow morning. Roy made a call after you left. Hartley had his phone. That call got her moving." Dot sat at the kitchen table. "Tomorrow morning," she said. "Roy's house in 2 other locations simultaneously." A pause. "Dot, is the house locked?" "Yes." "Good." The sound of a road in the background distance being covered. "Get some sleep if you can." "Wade," she said. "Are you riding and talking to me at the same time?" A pause. "I have an earpiece." "All right," she said. "I'll accept that." He arrived in 9 minutes. She had unlocked the door before he knocked. He came through and stood in the small living room with the same systematic attention he gave every space he entered, his eyes moving across it completely before he committed to it. She put tea in front of him at the kitchen table. He wrapped both hands around the mug. They sat in the quiet house in the middle of the high desert night. "Hartley goes in at 6 a.m., he said, "to the diner. And Roy's house and a property outside of town she's had on her list." Dot looked at her tea. "After tomorrow, Roy is done." "After tomorrow," Wade said, "Roy is thoroughly and permanently done." She thought about the mason jar. She thought about $20 a week for 11 months. She thought about the 2 well-dressed men in the unlocked back exit, and the phrase the old woman, "keep it that way." She thought about Danny in planet pajamas at the end of the counter at 1:20 in the morning, looking down the hallway toward the light under Roy's door. She let out a long breath. "Danny's surgery," she said. "May." "It's confirmed," Wade said. "Renata Wells called Friday afternoon. The slot is finalized." "You knew Friday." I wanted Fenwick's referral letter in hand before I told you, he said. It came through Monday morning. He drank his tea. He turned the mug between his hands. He's going to be all right, Dot. Danny is going to be all right. Not as consolation, not as comfort offered to manage her distress, as a statement of something he had decided. The declaration of a man who had learned 28 years ago what it cost to let the alternative happen, and who had decided that this time the outcome would be different, and who made his decisions the way he made all his decisions, completely without reservation, without giving himself a way out of them. Dot looked at him across the kitchen table. She looked at the scar along his jaw, in the gray at his temples, in the storm weather eyes that were right now perfectly steady. I know, she said. She said it not as agreement offered to make him feel better, but as her own independent conclusion, reached by the same route she reached all her conclusions by, looking at the full available evidence and making her best assessment. The evidence was this man had called Fenwick before she knew he had. This man had a payment on file with a coordinator in Houston. This man had ridden to her street tonight without being asked. This man carried a photograph of a 9-year-old boy in his breast pocket and had carried it there for 28 years. She trusted her assessments. She had been making them in high-stakes rooms for 31 years. She was not wrong about this one. Wade, she said, tell me about Tommy. He looked at his mug for a moment. Then he looked at her with the gaze of someone deciding how much of a door to open. He liked motorcycles, he said, obviously. A pause. He was good at math, better than me. He used to correct my estimates on the bike, like I'd say the carburetor mix was off by about this much, and he'd say, no, Dad, it's that much, and he'd be right. Something moved in his face. Not a smile, not quite, the ghost of it. He was going to be taller than me. His pediatrician said so. He had another half-inch in him at least. He stopped. Dot sat across the table from him and let the silence hold what it needed to hold. After a while, Wade said, he would have been 37 this year. What month? Dot said. October. She nodded. She looked at her tea. Carol was in October too, she said. The 2nd. Wade looked at her. Your daughter. Yes. She held her mug. She liked to cook. She made this stew. She learned it from me. I learned it from my mother. She made it better than I do, honestly. She had a lighter hand with the chili. Dot looked at the window above the sink. Danny doesn't know that yet. I haven't told him yet because I'm not sure he's ready to hear that there were things his mother did better than I do. He needs to believe I'm completely capable for a little longer. Wade was quiet. She would have liked you, Dot said. She was a good judge of people. She had a way of seeing past the surface of things very quickly. She paused. Danny has the same thing. Wade turned his mug. Yeah, he said after a moment. I know. Dot looked at him. He was looking at the table in front of him with the expression of a man sitting inside something large, not struggling with it, but simply inhabiting it, the way you inhabit things you have carried for long enough that they become not lighter, but more familiar in their weight. I should check the perimeter, he said. All right, she said. He stood. He went to the door. At the threshold, the pause that was his signature, the thing said into the space before leaving, he said, he's going to be fine, Danny. I mean that as a factual statement. I know you do, she said. He went out. She sat at the kitchen table for a while longer. Through the front window, she could see the 2 Iron Mercy bikes on the curb, their riders patient and still in the desert dark. She thought about Roy going into federal custody in the morning. She thought about Hartley saying they were moving the timeline up. She thought about 6 a.m. and what it would change and what it would leave unchanged and what the rest of the year would look like after it. She rinsed the mugs. She turned off the kitchen light. She went to bed. She slept. Cal Briggs called at 6:40 in the morning. Dot was already up. She had been up since 5:50, sitting at the kitchen table with her hands around a mug of coffee, watching the desert outside the window go from black to deep gray to the particular pale gold of early morning in the high desert in spring. She answered on the first ring. It's done, Cal said. Roy was taken from his house at 6:14. No incident. Two associates were picked up simultaneously at a property on the county road east of town. The diner is sealed. A pause. The federal case is moving into its next phase. The U.S. Attorney's Office will want a formal statement from you, probably next week. I'll be available, Dot said. The wage theft case is separate, he said. Sandra Pruitt is going to have an unambiguous situation to work with once the federal proceedings clear the way. Roy's assets are going to be a complicated picture, but there will be something there for civil action. Thank you, Cal, she said. A pause. Dot. What you did, the documentation, the calls, all of it, I want to say it plainly, that's not nothing. That's what broke this open. It was necessary, she said. Yes, he said, it was. Another pause, the kind that holds something a person is working up to saying. The men who were at your house last night, the motorcycles, they were keeping watch, Dot said. I know, we saw them on the drive-by. He paused again, and she could hear in it the specific effort of a 22-year law enforcement veteran acknowledging something that did not fit neatly into his professional framework. They were in the right place. I want to say that for the record. I'll tell them, she said. She drove to Patrice's house to collect Danny. It was just after 7. The desert was brilliant with early light, the clear, tilted light of a spring morning, when the sky has not yet become the flat white of noon, and everything casts long shadows, and the mountains to the east hold their best color in the first hour after sunrise. Danny was up. He was sitting at Patrice's kitchen table with his cereal and his deep-sea book, which he had apparently brought to a sleepover, because carrying a book somewhere was simply what Danny did. He looked up when Dot came in. He looked at her face. He looked at it the way he always looked at her face, with the careful, calibrated attention of a child who had learned early and permanently that adults' faces carried information they did not always choose to share aloud. It's over, he said. Not a question. Roy is in federal custody, Dot said. Yes, it's over. Danny set down his spoon. He thought about this with the deliberate seriousness he applied to significant information, not rushing to respond, letting the fact settle before he decided what to do with it. Then, is the diner still going to be there? Not as it was, Dot said. Probably not at all. Good, Danny said. He picked up his spoon. He was taking your tips. I counted the jar once, and then you only got $20. He said it plainly as a statement of the same category as any other fact. I knew you were working on it. I didn't want to make it harder. Dot sat down across from him at Patrice's kitchen table. She looked at her grandson. She looked at the way the morning light came through the window behind him and caught the edge of his dark hair. And she thought about Carol, who had sat at 100 kitchen tables in the same light, with the same dark hair, and the same habit of looking at things directly and saying what she saw. Danny, she said, you are your mother's son. He looked up. Is that good? That is the best thing I know how to say to you, she said. The very best. He thought about this. He gave it the weight it deserved. Then he nodded, once the decisive nod of someone who has applied independent judgment to the evidence and reached a conclusion. He picked up his book. Can we go home? He said. I want to draw. They went home. Dot called Renata Wells at Texas Children's Hospital in Houston on Saturday morning. The call took 11 minutes. Renata Wells was efficient and warm in the precise combination that the best medical coordinators achieve. She had all the information and conveyed it without hurrying, and she had the professional good sense to pause in the right places and let the parent, or in this case, the grandmother, and she addressed Dot as grandmother without having to be told, which Dot noted and appreciated. Ask her questions without treating the questions as delays. Danny's surgery was scheduled for May 19th. Dr. Patel's team would need the blood work completed at Fenwick's office in El Paso no later than the 1st of May. Pre-operative instructions would arrive by mail and email. A patient-family liaison would be in contact to walk through logistics, housing during the hospital stay, the specifics of the recovery protocol, everything that surrounded the medical event itself. Renata confirmed at the end that the procedure was fully paid. She used the words private beneficiary, said with the practiced discretion of someone who had been instructed not to elaborate and was entirely comfortable with that instruction. Dot thanked her. She sat at the kitchen table after hanging up. May 19th, 5 weeks and 3 days. She texted Wade spoke to Houston. May 19th confirmed. Thank you. The response came in under 4 minutes. Good. One word. She had been learning this language for weeks now. The language of a man who said only what he meant and meant completely what he said, and had concluded at some point across the years that the feelings that mattered most were too large for the available vocabulary, and that compression was more honest than approximation. Good meant, I am glad. It meant, this is what I intended. It meant I was not going to let it go any other way. She wrote back, come Wednesday, stew will be ready. A pause. Then, we'll be there. She put down the phone. She sat in the morning light of her kitchen. She looked at the mason jar on the dresser in her room, visible through the open doorway, the one with $1,520 in it, the one she looked at for 30 seconds each morning. She would call Sandra Pruitt on Monday. She would give her formal statement to the U.S. Attorney. Roy's assets, whatever they amounted to, after the federal proceedings ran their course, would be the subject of a civil action that Sandra had said would be straightforward given the documentation. She did not expect the world to be made entirely right. She expected what the law and the process provided, and she intended to pursue it to its complete conclusion. That was enough. That had always been enough, not because she had low expectations, but because she understood the difference between what could be recovered and what could not, and did not waste energy on the latter. The surgery would happen. Danny's valve would be repaired. The man who had been taking her tips for 11 months was in federal custody. She had Wade's number in the back of her address book. She stood up from the table. She got out the flour. She was going to make biscuits because Danny had asked 3 days ago, and she had said Saturday, and it was Saturday. He appeared in the kitchen doorway 20 minutes later, still in his pajamas, his drawing pad under one arm. He looked at the mixing bowl and the measured flour, and the particular expression on his grandmother's face that meant, we are doing something ordinary and important at the same time. Biscuits, he said. Biscuits, she confirmed. He put down the drawing pad and washed his hands at the sink. He came to stand beside her at the counter. She showed him where to cut in the butter. He did it carefully with focus, his tongue pressed between his teeth. The morning went on in the kitchen with its familiar sounds and its familiar light, and outside the desert was doing what it always did, holding its enormous, indifferent space in every direction. The Florida mountains dark blue on the eastern horizon, the sky above them, the clear, particular blue of a New Mexico spring morning that had no adequate description, and that Dot had been looking at for 11 years without finding one. She did not try to find one now. She just looked at it briefly through the window above the sink, and then she went back to the biscuits. Wednesday came with the particular clarity that clear desert nights produce a sky so dense with stars by 10 o'clock that the darkness itself seemed to have texture and the air cold enough to be felt immediately when you stepped out of a building. The kind of cold that makes you aware of the specific warmth you carry inside yourself. Dot drove in at 11. She made coffee. She set the stew pot on a full pot, the largest she had, because Wade had said they'd be there, and she had no precise count, and it was always better to have more. She cut the cornbread and covered it with a clean cloth to stay warm. She set the counter. At 11:48, the engines arrived. Not 8 this time. She watched through the plate glass as the headlights appeared on 180-12510. The formation, still coming, still coming. They swept into the lot and the gravel margin beside the highway and kept going until the diagonal line of motorcycles extended further than she could see clearly from the window. She counted what she could see, 35 more still arriving. When the engines cut, the silence that followed had a particular quality, the specific silence left by a large, coordinated sound when it stops all at once. The silence of aftermath rather than absence. They came through the door in a steady stream and filled the counter, in the booths, and stood along the walls. 47 men in black leather with Iron Mercy patches, and the quiet, serious attention of people who had come somewhere with a purpose and intended to honor it. The diner, which on its best nights served 12 people comfortably, was full in a way it had never been full before. Not chaotic, not loud, but full in the way a room is full when the people in it are entirely present. Wade came through the door with them and sat at the same stool. He looked at Dot. She looked at him. She let the moment say what it said, which was considerable. Then she picked up the ladle and got to work. She could not have fed 47 men with one pot of stew. There were 4 pans of cornbread. She poured coffee in every cup and vessel she could find, passed plates through the order window, worked the counter, in the booths, and the men standing against the walls, with the systematic efficiency of someone who had managed complex, high-pressure rooms for 3 decades. Men who were already done eating passed their plates back and made room for the men who hadn't eaten yet. The whole operation organized itself naturally and without direction, the way things organize themselves when the people involved understand what they're there for. Danny was at the counter. He had his drawing pad, the finished version of the diner scene, the one he had been working on for 2 weeks, the one with the counter and the booths and the fluorescent light done in cross-hatching, and the 3 figures, the large man with the mug and the woman behind the counter and the small shape in the back booth. When Wade sat down, Danny pushed the drawing across the counter to him without ceremony, without preamble or explanation, the way 9-year-olds give things directly, completely, because they have decided to give them, and have not yet learned to pad the gesture with qualification. Wade picked it up. He looked at it for a long time. The diner was full of the low, layered sound of 47 men eating and talking, but in the particular space between Wade and Danny, there was a quiet, not an absence of sound, but the specific quiet of 2 people paying close attention to something that mattered. Wade looked at the figure with the large hands wrapped around the mug. He looked at the woman behind the counter. He looked at the small figure in the corner of the back booth. "You put all of us in," he said. "Yeah," Danny said. He pointed to each figure with the clear, uncomplicated confidence of an artist explaining his work to someone he trusts to understand it. "That's you. That's Grandma. That's me. I got the scar right this time. I checked it 3 times. He paused, examining his own work. "The light is still a little off in the back. I couldn't get the shadows exactly right, but the proportions are correct." Wade looked at the drawing. Something moved in his face, the thing that lived just before certain expressions in people who have learned to be careful about what they show. The anterior state of something larger that had been held under long pressure and was choosing carefully and deliberately to show itself. "You can keep it," Danny said. "I made it for you." Wade folded the drawing, not in half, but in thirds, the precise, deliberate fold of someone intending to carry something without damaging it, and put it into his inner breast pocket, the same pocket where he kept the photograph. Dot, watching from the coffee station, did not say anything. There were no words for what was happening in the particular space between a man who had carried a photograph in his breast pocket for 28 years and a 9-year-old boy who had drawn a picture and given it to him because he thought the man would want it. Whatever language that required had not been invented yet. She was not going to reach for an approximation of it. She refilled cups. She carried plates. She worked. Later, when the meal was done and the men were beginning to move toward the door in the same quiet, organized way they had arrived, Wade remained on his stool after the others. He set his payment on the counter. He looked at Dot. "May 19th, he said. "That's right, Houston." "Yes." He held her gaze. "We'll be there," he said. Dot looked at him. "Wade, it's a surgery. It's going to be 6 hours, probably more. It's a hospital waiting room." "I know what a hospital waiting room is," he said. His voice was perfectly level and perfectly certain. "We'll be there." She thought about Agent Hartley asking about her safety buffer. She thought about 47 motorcycles in a lot that had never held more than 12 cars. She thought about what it meant that this man who had been carrying a door, closed on a Tuesday morning in Tucson for 28 years, had decided that May 19th in Houston was going to go differently and had organized everything he could organize around that decision and intended to be present for the outcome. "All right," she said. He stood. He pulled his cut straight. He picked up his helmet. At the threshold, the pause, the half turn the thing set into the space before going, he said, "The stew. Tell me the recipe sometime." Dot looked at him. She thought about her mother's kitchen in Silver City, the smell of roasted hatch chilies and browning beef on a Sunday afternoon. She thought about Carol learning to make it at 12 years old, standing on the step stool because she wasn't tall enough to reach the stove comfortably, refusing to use the step stool by 14 because by then height had become a matter of principle. She thought about the specific way Carol had learned to handle the chili lighter than Dot, more confident, the touch of someone who had internalized the recipe and then quietly improved it. "Next time you come in," Dot said, "I'll write it down." Wade nodded. He went through the door. She watched through the glass as he walked to the large, custom cruiser at the head of the line and mounted it with the same deliberate care he brought to every movement. She watched him sit for a moment with both hands on the tank head, slightly down, the habitual pause of a man settling himself, centering himself before committing to forward motion. Then the engine turned over. 47 engines, one after another in a rolling cascade of sound that filled the parking lot and the highway margin and the cold desert night around them. And then as the formation moved out onto 180 and gathered speed, began to diminish the long, clean diminuendo of things in motion, of distance being made of a formation moving purposefully toward what came next. She watched the last taillight disappear into the dark. Then the lot was empty, and the night came back around the diner with its usual cold and silence and the immense, indifferent stars. The fluorescent tubes hummed their discordant hum above the empty counter. The coffee machine cycled its quiet routine at the far end of the room. Danny was at her elbow. He had come up quietly the way he sometimes did, materializing beside her without announcement, simply present the way children are present, when they have not yet learned to make an event out of their own arrival. "He took my drawing," Danny said. "He did. Do you think he'll keep it?" Dot looked out the plate glass window at the empty lot, at the place where 47 motorcycles had stood at the highway beyond it, stretching west into the dark. "I think he'll keep it for a very long time," she said. Danny leaned against her side. He was the weight and warmth of a living child, the specific gravity of someone whose heart was imperfect and holding and soon to be repaired, who drew things with accurate proportions and noticed when the light was wrong, and had his mother's eyes and his great-grandmother's recipe in his future, and a man in Houston who had already paid for the surgeon because he had decided once and for all, and without reservation, that this time the outcome was going to be different. "Time to close up," Dot said. They closed up together. She wiped the counter while he stacked the chairs. She washed the last of the pots while he carried the cornbread pan to the rack. They worked in the easy, practiced silence of two people who had been keeping house together long enough that the tasks were shared without discussion, each knowing their part. The whole thing running with the particular domestic efficiency of genuine partnership between people who love each other and don't need to say so every time because they show it in the way they move around each other in a kitchen. When the lights were off and the door was locked and they were standing in the cold parking lot in the deep, clear New Mexico midnight, Danny tilted his head back and looked at the sky. "Grandma," he said, is it true that some of those stars are already gone? Like they burned out a long time ago, but we're still seeing the light from them?" "Yes," she said. "That's true. The light takes so long to travel to us that by the time it arrives, some of those stars have already ended." Danny was quiet for a moment, looking up. "So we're seeing the past," he said. "Yes, we're seeing what they were. That's kind of sad," he said. He thought about it. "But also the light keeps going even after the thing is gone. It just keeps traveling." Dot stood in the parking lot of the diner that Roy Steck had run for years as a front for something corrupt, in the same lot where she had walked out with a piece of rebar at 2 in the morning because she was tired of watching things get taken, and she looked up at the sky with her grandson And she thought about Tommy, who would have been 37 in October, and about Carol, who had stood in kitchens making stew and tacking watercolors to refrigerators and not knowing she had only so many Octobers left. She thought about all the things that had ended and the light that kept coming from them anyway, arriving in the faces of the people who carried them forward, illuminating the specific spaces where the living were doing the necessary work of continuing. Yes, she said, that's exactly right. The light keeps going. She took Danny's hand. Come on, she said. Let's go home. They walked to the Civic together in the brilliant, cold dark. The Florida mountains were shadows against a sky full of traveling light. The desert stretched out in every direction, immense and quiet, and entirely indifferent to everything except its own ancient, ongoing business. She unlocked the car. They got in. She started the engine and sat for a moment while it warmed the heater, coming on with its familiar sound. The dash lights steady and soft in the dark. Grandma, Danny said. I'm glad you walked out there that night with the rebar. He was looking out the windshield at the dark highway. I know it wasn't just about the bikes, but I'm glad you did it. Dot looked at her grandson. He was looking straight ahead, the way he sometimes did, when he said the things he had been thinking about for a while, not looking at her, looking at the horizon. Because he was 9 years old, and he had his mother's way of knowing when a thing was true, and saying it without making more of a ceremony out of it than it required. Me too, she said. She put the car in drive. She pulled out of the lot and onto Highway 180 and pointed them east toward Deming, toward the small adobe house on the quiet street with the kitchen window that faced the mountains, and the mason jar on the dresser, and the legal pad on the counter with a recipe she was going to write out tomorrow morning before she called Sandra Pruitt. The mountains to the east were dark blue shapes against a sky full of light that had been traveling for longer than she could comprehend. Danny's breathing was steady beside her, the easy breathing of a child who was not afraid of what was coming, who had looked at the full situation with his mother's dark eyes and his own careful intelligence, and decided as Dot had decided that they were equal to it. She drove. The desert went by on either side of them, flat and immense, and absolutely itself, the way it always was, the way it would be long after all of them were gone and their light was still traveling. She was 68 years old. Her grandson needed a surgery, and it was paid for. A man she had known for less than 2 months had folded a child's drawing into his breast pocket beside the photograph of his son. Roy Steck was in federal custody. The proper channels were doing the work they were built to do. She had her records in order. She had always had her records in order. The highway ran straight and clear through the dark, the headlights picking out the white center line and the empty miles ahead. She had driven this stretch so many times in 11 months that she knew its particular rhythms, the curve at mile marker 41, the cattle guard just before the county road turnoff, the place where the mountains came back into view on the right side. If you knew where to look. She knew where to look. She always had. They drove home through the traveling dark, the woman and the boy, the light from 1,000 dead stars, falling all around them, gentle and indifferent, and completely without end. The blood work appointment was on a Thursday morning in early April at Fenwick's office in El Paso, 2 hours south on Interstate 25, and then east on 10 through the wide, flat basin of the Chihuahuan Desert, with the Oregon Mountains coming up on the right side and the whole southwest sky going enormous and blue above them. Dot had told Danny the night before, straightforwardly and completely, the way she had always told him things that mattered. The doctors in Houston were going to fix his valve. The surgery was scheduled. It was paid for. They would drive to Houston together in May, and they would come back together in June. And by summer, he would be able to run at full speed on the playground without the careful self-monitoring he had learned to apply to his own exertion. The learned restraint that no 9-year-old should have to know, the constant low-level accounting of effort against consequence that had become so automatic that Danny did it without appearing to think about it, the way people breathe. He had listened to all of it with his usual deliberate attention. He had asked specific questions. How long would the surgery take? Would it hurt afterward? When could he go back to school? And Dot had answered each one honestly, because he deserved honesty and had always been able to carry it. Then he had said, 47 repairs. That's a lot of practice. It is, Dot agreed. Okay, he said. And he had meant it, the particular okay of a child who has assessed the available information and reached a genuine conclusion, rather than the okay children use to end conversations they find difficult. He was his mother's son. He assessed and concluded and moved forward. In the car on the way to El Paso, Danny read the third volume of the Deep Sea series, the one about hydrothermal vent communities and chemosynthesis, the organisms that had found a way to live in total darkness and extreme pressure and temperatures that should have been lethal, that had looked at an environment built entirely wrong for survival and figured out across millennia of iteration how to make it work anyway. He looked up from the book somewhere past Las Cruces. Grandma, he said, these worms, the ones at the vents, they can live to be over 200 years old. Is that right? Dot said. Yeah, because nothing really stresses them out properly. They just exist at the right temperature and keep going. He looked at the page. I think I want to be a marine biologist. I thought you wanted to be an engineer. I can be both, he said with the complete seriousness of someone who has not yet been told that you generally have to choose. He went back to his book. Dot drove through the desert and thought about existing at the right temperature and keeping going. She thought about 31 years of impossible rooms. She thought about 11 months of $20 Fridays. She thought about the mason jar on the dresser, which now held $2,200 because Sandra Pruitt had confirmed that the New Mexico Labor Department had issued Roy Steck a preliminary notice of wage violation and that a back payment order was already in process. Not the full amount, not the $6,000 the conservative estimate suggested, but some of it, enough to confirm that what she had documented was real and documented correctly and was going to be acknowledged. She thought about the distinction between justice and the acknowledgement of a wrong. They were not the same thing. Justice implied restoration, the full recovery of what was taken, the complete undoing of the harm. The acknowledgement of a wrong was something smaller, something incomplete, something that nonetheless required seeing the wrong clearly and naming it without flinching. She had learned in 31 years of medicine that most of what was available to offer was of this second kind. You could not bring back the years of a person's life. You could not restore the specific, irreplaceable quality of what had been lost. But you could look at what had happened clearly and name it and do what was possible in the present. And that was not nothing. It was in fact the whole of what was possible. And it was enough. Fenwick's office was on the 4th floor of a medical building near University Medical Center, with windows that looked east toward the Franklin Mountains, the westernmost tail of the Rockies, abrupt and dramatic, and already showing the dry ochre of a late spring that had not delivered much rain. The blood work took 20 minutes. Danny sat in the phlebotomy chair with his sleeve rolled up and looked at the needle with the calm interest of a child who had been in enough medical settings to have lost the reflexive fear of them and replaced it with a kind of clinical curiosity. He asked the phlebotomist what each tube would be used for. She told him one by one. He nodded at each answer with the focused attention of someone taking notes. Fenwick himself came in to see them briefly after the draw. He sat across from Dot and spoke with the measured, precise warmth he always brought a man who cared about his patients and had learned that the most useful form of care was accuracy, that families were better served by the truth than by the comfort that dissolves when the truth arrives anyway. The referral to Dr. Patel is fully processed, he said. I reviewed his team's outcomes data last week. The repair rate and the post-operative quality of life metrics are the best in the country for Danny's presentation. You're in the right hands. A pause. He's going to do very well, Mrs. Wren. He said it with the same measured precision he brought to everything, not as reassurance offered to manage her anxiety, but as a clinical assessment, as a statement of what the evidence indicated. Thank you, Dr. Fenwick, she said. On the way home, Danny fell asleep east of Las Cruces, the deep sea book still open in his lap, his head tipped against the window, and his face perfectly relaxed in sleep. Dot drove and let him sleep. She watched the desert and the sky and the long shadows of the late afternoon, and she thought about May 19th and about what came after it, and about the version of the coming summer in which Danny ran on the playground at full speed without accounting for it. She thought about that version with the particular intensity of someone who had been holding a number in mind for 11 months. Not the 62,000, but the image behind it, the specific future it represented, and who could feel that future becoming incrementally less contingent. Still contingent. Surgery was still surgery. Dr. Patel's 47 procedures were 47 successful arguments for probability rather than certainty. Dot was not a woman who confused probability with certainty. She was a nurse, and nurses understood the difference better than most, because they had been in the rooms where probability failed. But she had done everything that could be done from her position. She had found the right doctor. She had made the calls. She had kept her records in order. She had walked into the parking lot with the rebar, and she had talked to the FBI, and she had written the recipe on the legal pad, which was folded in her coat pocket right now waiting for Wednesday. The rest was medicine. Medicine was not perfect, but in the hands of the right people, applied at the right time, with the right preparation, it was very, very good. She drove. Danny slept. The mountains came up on the right side as she approached Deming, dark blue in the early evening light. The same mountain she had been watching from her kitchen window for 11 years. She had watched them in every season and in every quality of light. The flat white of noon in July, the deep red of sunset in October, the sharp, clear blue of early morning in March, when the air was cold enough to make the contours precise. She had been watching them when Carol called on Sunday evenings. She had been watching them in the weeks after Carol stopped calling. She would be watching them for as long as she lived here, which she intended to be a very long time. She took the Deming exit. She drove the familiar streets, the main drag with its closed-up shops and the surviving gas station, and the school where Danny went every morning and where she picked him up every afternoon. And then the residential streets, quieter and slower, until she turned onto her own block and pulled into the driveway of the small adobe house. She sat for a moment with the engine idling. Danny had not woken when she turned off the highway. He was still deeply asleep, his breathing the slow, full rhythm of genuine rest, his face holding Carol's shape in the particular, clear, uncomplicated way it held it when he slept, as though sleep stripped away everything acquired and left only what was inherited. Dot sat and looked at him. She had been 67 years old when he arrived with his 2 suitcases and his drawing pad. She had been a retired charge nurse with a pension and a small house and a plan for the next 20 years that had not included any of this. She was 68 now, and she was a year into something that had no plan beyond the next morning's medication and the next month's appointment and the mason jar on the dresser, and the number that had seemed to be perpetually receding, and that was now, for the first time in 11 months, close enough to touch. She was exactly where she needed to be. She understood this in the way you understand the things that have stopped being chosen and become simply true. She turned off the engine. She touched Danny's shoulder gently. He surfaced from sleep slowly the way he always did, with the unhurried ease of a child who had not yet had to learn to distrust waking up. "We're home," she said. He blinked. He looked out the window at the house. He looked at her. "Is it dinner time?" he said. "Almost," she said. "Can we have the stew?" he said. She looked at her grandson. She thought about her mother standing at a stove in Silver City. She thought about Carol on a step stool at 12 years old, refusing the step stool at 14, making the stew better than Dot had ever made it, with a lighter hand and more confidence, and the particular ease of someone who had absorbed something completely and then quietly made it her own. "Yes," Dot said. "We can have the stew." They went inside. She took off her coat. She reached into the pocket and took out the folded legal pad page, the recipe written out in her careful nurse's hand, the one she had been carrying since she wrote it out last Saturday morning in the early light at the kitchen table. She set it on the counter where she would see it. She would give it to Wade on Wednesday. She had said she would, and she would. She filled the pot. She set the burner on low. Danny set the table without being asked, which was the kind of thing he did now, the natural assumption of shared domestic responsibility that had developed so gradually across 11 months that she could not have named the moment it started. He set 2 plates and 2 glasses, and the pill cup for the evening metoprolol. He folded the napkins the way she folded them in thirds. She started the onions. The kitchen filled with the smell of them softening in oil, one of the fundamental smells, the smell that means food is being made and someone is being fed. That had been in every kitchen she had ever stood in since she was old enough to stand at a stove. "Grandma," Danny said, sitting at the table with his elbows on the wood, watching her work. Do you think Wade misses Tommy?" Dot stood at the stove. She let the question sit for a moment because it deserved a moment. "I think he carries Tommy," she said, "every day. I don't think it feels like missing anymore. Exactly missing is something that happens in the early days when the absence is a surprise every time. What Wade has is different. It's more like Tommy is with him, in the pocket, in the way he does things." Danny was quiet for a moment. "Like how you carry Mom," he said. Dot looked at the onions. She looked at the flame under the pot. "Yes," she said. "Like that, exactly." Danny nodded. He looked at the table. He straightened his napkin. "I drew Mom in the new one," he said. "The new diner drawing. She's not in the diner, she's through the window. In the parking lot, standing by the car. You can't really tell it's her. It's just a shape. But I know it's her." Dot stood at the stove and breathed. "Can I see it?" she said. "Yeah," he said. "After dinner." She turned back to the pot. She added the beef, the green chili, the tomatoes, the spices, in the order her mother had always added them, the order that had been correct since before she was born. She turned the flame down and put the lid on and let it go. The kitchen filled with the smell of the stew. Danny talked about the deep sea worms and whether the pressure at the bottom of the Mariana Trench was actually survivable for certain microorganisms, and whether organisms that didn't need sunlight could potentially exist on other planets around other stars. And Dot listened to him talk and stirred the pot and thought about old light traveling through an indifferent universe and arriving after everything at the faces of the people who needed it. She thought about a man who would be sitting in a hospital waiting room in Houston in 5 weeks. She thought about 47 motorcycles in a parking structure and the sound of them idling patient and certain. She thought about Danny, who would go into surgery with his valve imperfect and come out with it repaired, and who would run on the playground in June without accounting for it, and who would keep drawing and keep reading and keep asking the right questions and keep growing in the direction of something she could already see the shape of, even if he couldn't yet. She thought about Carol, who had stood in this kitchen, who had learned this recipe on a step stool, who was through the window in a drawing, in a 9-year-old's drawing pad in the parking lot by the car, as a shape that you could only recognize if you knew to look. She thought, this is what there is. The kitchen, and the stew, and the boy at the table, and the light coming in from the window above the sink, the recipe on the counter, the number in the address book, the mountains outside going deep blue in the last of the evening light. This is what there is, and it is enough, and it is more than enough, and it is in every way that matters exactly what was needed. She ladled the stew into 2 bowls. She set Danny's in front of him with the evening pill cup. She sat across from him. Outside, the desert settled into its nighttime dark, and the stars began one by one, and then all at once to appear in the enormous New Mexico sky. Old light from distant sources, still traveling, arriving without announcement, falling on the small, warm houses below where people were eating dinner and doing their homework and taking their medications and making their plans and carrying each of them. The particular weight of what they loved and what they had lost and what they intended to do next. Dot picked up her spoon. "Tell me more about the worms," she said. Danny looked up from his bowl. His face was his mother's face in the kitchen light, and it was his own face becoming more itself, every day becoming more of what it was going to be, the face of a person who paid attention and cared about accuracy and did not look away from difficult things, and would, she was certain, figure out how to make whatever environment he found himself in work for him, the way organisms figure things out when the alternative is not figuring them out. He picked up his spoon. He told her about the worms. The night came on fully around the small adobe house on the quiet street in Deming, New Mexico, and the mountains to the east were dark shapes, and the stars were brilliant and traveling and indifferent. And inside the kitchen the stew was hot, and the light was warm, and the woman and the boy ate together in the easy, particular silence of two people who love each other and are not afraid of the same silence, and do not need to fill it with anything except the occasional question about deep-sea organisms and the sound of spoons in bowls, and the specific domestic music of a household that is in the fullest and most accurate meaning of the word home. The recipe page was still on the counter the next morning when Dot came into the kitchen at 6:30 to start coffee. She picked it up and read through it. Her handwriting was the same it had been for 40 years, the clear, slightly angular print of a woman who had spent decades writing things that needed to be read, correctly by other people, under pressure, notes and orders and observations that admitted no ambiguity. The recipe read the same way: precise quantities, specific sequence. The note at the end, the one her mother had always included: patience is the only ingredient that cannot be substituted for. She folded it along its thirds and put it in her coat pocket. She made coffee. She looked out the window above the sink at the mountains, which were showing the first light of morning on their eastern faces, the brief, specific rose gold of sunrise on rock that lasted for about 12 minutes and then was gone until the next morning. She had been watching this window for 11 years, and she still looked at those 12 minutes when they happened. She expected she always would. Danny came in at 7:15, hair uncombed, Cardinals sweatshirt drawing pad under his arm, because he had apparently brought it to the kitchen for reasons he would explain in his own time, or not at all. He accepted his pill cup without comment, the automatic competence of a child who has done the same thing at the same hour for long enough that it has stopped being a task and become simply part of what mornings are. He sat at the table. He opened the drawing pad. Dot poured his juice. She looked at the page he had opened to. It was the one he had described last night, the diner scene, the counter and the men and the fluorescent light done in cross-hatching. And through the plate glass window of the diner, visible in the parking lot beyond the biker's line of motorcycles, a figure standing by a car. Small, slightly blurred, the sketch lines loose and suggestive rather than precise. Not trying to be a portrait, trying to be a presence. Dot looked at it for a long moment. She looked at the way Danny had drawn the light coming through the plate glass, the interior fluorescent warmth falling outward through the window and catching the edge of the figure in the lot, so that the woman outside was illuminated partially by the light from inside. Connected to it, even from the distance of the parking lot. That's good, Dot said. She said it the way Wade said it, as a precise verdict, rather than a compliment, because it was good and because accuracy was what Carol had always wanted from her. Danny looked at the drawing. I know, he said, not with vanity, with the same clean, honest certainty that he brought to everything he believed to be true. He closed the pad. He picked up his juice. He said, "What are we doing today?" Dot thought about the legal pad page in her coat pocket. She thought about Wednesday, which was 3 days away. She thought about May 19th, which was 32 days away. She thought about the summer, which would come after with its long evenings and its heat, and Danny running on the playground at full speed without accounting for it. Today, she said, we are going to the library. You need the next book in that series. Danny considered. Volume 4 is about deep ocean trenches, the geological formations. I know, Dot said. You already looked it up. I did. He smiled a small, specific smile, the smile of a child who has been known completely by someone and has learned that being known completely is not a diminishment, but the opposite of one. Okay, he said. They went to the library. They came home. They made lunch. Danny read and Dot paid bills, and the afternoon went by in the long, quiet, unremarkable way that afternoons go by when nothing is wrong and you are where you need to be. The mountains outside the kitchen window moved through their daily sequence of light and shadow. The coffee machine in the kitchen cycled through its ordinary business. At 3:50, Danny looked up from his book and said, 32 days. Dot looked up from the table. Until the surgery, he said. 32 days. Yes, she said. He looked at her. He had his mother's dark eyes and his grandmother's habit of looking at difficult things directly, which meant he had from two directions the same fundamental disposition. The disposition of someone who did not look away. I'm not scared, he said. I know, she said. Are you scared? Dot looked at her grandson across the kitchen table in the afternoon light. I trust Dr. Patel, she said. I trust Fenwick. I trust the 47 procedures that came before yours. She paused. And I trust that whatever happens, we face it together. You and me. Danny looked at her for a moment. And Wade, he said. Dot thought about 47 motorcycles in a hospital parking structure in Houston. She thought about a man sitting in a waiting room chair for 6 to 8 hours with his hands wrapped around a paper coffee cup. She thought about a drawing folded in thirds in a breast pocket beside a photograph of a 9-year-old boy who would have been 37 in October. And Wade, she said. Danny nodded. He went back to his book. The afternoon light came through the kitchen window and fell across the table between them, warm and even, and entirely ordinary. The kind of light that illuminates nothing dramatic, and is because of that, the kind you remember longest. Dot picked up her pen. She went back to the bills. Outside in the high desert, the light was doing what it always did, traveling from wherever it came from toward wherever it was going, indifferent to the distance, patient with the dark, arriving eventually at whatever it arrived at. It had been doing this longer than anyone had been watching it, and it would keep doing it long after everyone currently watching had stopped. This was not a sad thing. It was simply the nature of light, which did not need to be witnessed to keep traveling, but which was, when witnessed, one of the better arguments available for paying attention to where you were, and what was in front of you, and who was sitting across the table from you in the afternoon. Dot paid her bills. Danny read his book. The mountains went blue in the early evening. The recipe waited in her coat pocket. Wednesday was 3 days away. And after Wednesday, 32 days to Houston. And after Houston, the summer, and the full speed running on the playground, and whatever came after that, the long, ordinary, irreplaceable continuance of a life being lived by people who had decided separately and together, and in the particular way that people decide things when the alternative is unacceptable, that they were equal to it. She was. She always had been. She always would be.